I started walking dogs after I quit my job at the dealership. I didn't hate selling cars, but the pressure and the targets kept me up at night, and I needed something quiet for a while. Something that didn't involve lying to strangers or pretending to smile when I didn't mean it. So I downloaded a few pet sitting apps, bought some good walking shoes, and started picking up jobs in my neighborhood. Most of my regular clients lived in a stretch of older residential blocks that backed up to a long strip of green space. A narrow trail wound through it, and on one side, tall trees bordered backyards. On the other side was Hilltop Cemetery. That place wasn't exactly spooky, but it had its own quiet weight to it. Old stones, cracked angels, mossy plaques. The kind of place where time felt heavy. Most people didn't go there much unless they had someone buried in it. I walked past the cemetery at least 3 times a day. I'd usually have 1 or 2 dogs with me, always on a leash, always trotting along beside me, noses twitching. There was a path right along the inside edge of the fence that made for an easy loop. The fence itself wasn't old. Maybe 5 or 6 years back, the city put in these solar-powered metal posts all along the border. They weren't even connected by actual wire or rail, just black metal stakes, each with a blinking green light near the top and a little screen about the size of a deck of cards on one side. At first, I thought they were some kind of basic motion sensor or lights. Later, I read online that they were part of a weather-aware boundary system, something that pulled in temperature, wind, soil moisture, even air quality. Sounded overkill for a cemetery, but I guess someone got a grant for it. The first time I noticed anything strange, I had Max with me. Big golden retriever. Friendly, dumb as a rock. It was late October, right before daylight savings. The sun had started setting earlier, and the light was already going gold, even though it was only 5 o'clock. We were walking past the cemetery, and Max stopped like he caught a scent. But instead of sniffing the ground or tugging the leash, he just stood dead still, ears up, facing one of the fence posts. Then I heard it faint garbled. A voice, just a few feet away, coming from a metal post nearest us. I couldn't tell what it was saying. Something like, "Keep the door," then it faded into static. I looked around, confused. Nobody else was nearby. The street behind us was empty. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't on repeat. It was like a real person had just said something out loud into a bad speaker. Then nothing. I figured it was a glitch. Maybe a sensor chirping or interference from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Max looked uneasy, but after a few seconds, he started walking again, tail swinging. I told myself it was nothing. But 2 days later, with a different dog, Jasper, a loud little beagle, I passed the same area near the cemetery fence and I heard it again. Different post this time. It said clear as day. "I already told you, just close it." Jasper barked once, startled, then pulled to keep going. I stopped and stared at the post. Nothing blinked differently. The green light on top was steady. The little screen showed a temperature reading and humidity percent. But I knew I heard a voice. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't vague. It sounded real. A little compressed, like a voicemail on bad reception, but definitely human. I waited a minute, but nothing else came out. That was when I started paying attention. For a few days, nothing happened. I stuck to the same loop with the dogs, trying to keep my eyes on the posts. I even brought my phone out and opened the voice recorder. Sometimes I'd stop and just stand near one for a few minutes, pretending to adjust a leash or check a message. On the 5th day, around 6:30 p.m., with the sun down and the air turning cold, I heard it again. 2 words this time, very quick, "They're watching." The voice sounded close, female, maybe early 30s. I turned my head sharply, like someone had whispered it right beside me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was missing something. I sat in bed with my laptop and started reading about the fence system. It was a brand called Loxbridge Urban Grid, used mostly in city parks. I found a PDF from their site explaining how the fence posts formed a mesh network. Each one gathered weather data and transmitted it wirelessly to a hub station, usually located at a nearby municipal facility. Then I found a forum post on a city watchdog website. A guy claiming to be a network technician had posted a short thread about unauthorized firmware activity in municipal sensor arrays. He mentioned several areas, one of which was Hilltop Cemetery. According to him, The smart post had been running a version of open source firmware that had been modified by someone to allow expanded access to the microphone arrays inside them. I didn't even know the posts had mics. He explained, in technical terms, that someone had bypassed the normal limits and turned the fence posts into passive receivers, like tiny solar-powered ears. And because of some overlap with other mesh networks, they'd started picking up stray wireless audio feeds. Things like baby monitors, wireless intercoms, smart home speakers, anything that communicated via unsecured Wi-Fi or mesh protocols. That's when it clicked. The voices I heard, they weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were echoes, accidental recordings bouncing between devices. Somebody nearby had unsecured devices that were being picked up by these modified posts, then replayed out loud when the posts pinged each other to sync data. Like a bug in the system caused old audio to leak out at random. That made it worse in a way. At least ghosts would have been predictable. What I was hearing could have been anything from anyone's house. Arguments, secrets, who knows what. And the scariest part? Whoever altered the firmware had done it remotely, which meant they could still be listening. I thought about reporting it, but I wasn't even sure who to call. The city? The parks department? It wasn't illegal exactly, just dangerous, invasive. Then things escalated. Over the next 2 weeks, the voices got more frequent, never on a schedule, but always in that one stretch near the middle of the cemetery. One afternoon, I heard a man yelling, "Get off the stairs. You'll fall," followed by a long silence. Another time, it was someone saying, "Please don't say that," not in front of her, and then quiet crying. Always short clips, never more than 5 seconds, never repeated. Once, I heard what sounded like someone breathing heavily, just low huffing sounds like they were panicked or out of breath. That one didn't come with any words. That one made me leave early. I started carrying a small directional mic with me, plugged into my phone. I kept trying to record the voices, but they were too brief, too sudden. I'd get a chirp of static, or the tail end of a sentence, nothing clear enough to prove anything. Still, I kept walking that route. Something about it pulled at me. I wanted to understand. Then one morning, I noticed a guy parked across from the cemetery. He was sitting in a plain white van with no logos, just idling with a laptop open on his dash. I passed by him 3 times in 1 week. He never got out, just sat there watching the posts. The next time I saw him, I took a detour and circled back behind the van. I stood behind a tree, far enough to watch without being seen. After about 10 minutes, I saw him plug something into a post through a small panel on the side. It was quick, maybe 30 seconds. Then he got back in his van and drove off. That was the last day I heard voices. But that wasn't the end. A week later, I got a text from one of my clients. They had a smart speaker system in their house, camera doorbell, audio alerts, all linked through their Wi-Fi. The client asked me if I'd said anything into their hallway intercom the previous day. I told them no. I hadn't even gone inside. I just picked up the dog like always. They told me their system had recorded someone saying he's watching them again, right in the hallway. No one else had been home. They showed me the clip. It was a low, crackling voice, male, and definitely not me. It sounded exactly like the weird playback from the cemetery. That made my skin crawl. I didn't know how to respond. I just told them their system might have picked up interference. But that night, I unplugged every smart device in my apartment. Camera, speaker, thermostat, even my router. I sat in silence for hours, listening for anything. Watching the window. I never saw the van again. I never heard the voices again. But I know someone was listening, had been listening for a while. The smart fence wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what someone wanted it to do. It wasn't about weather data. It was about hearing people without them knowing. About collecting pieces of conversations, personal moments, private words, and letting them bleed into the open just enough to see who noticed. And I noticed. I changed my dog walking route after that. Started avoiding the cemetery. I took on fewer clients. Mostly stuck to daytime jobs. I got rid of my smartphone. Bought an old flip phone instead. Started paying cash for everything I could. I even stopped using social media. Because once you hear a system like that accidentally speak back, once you know that someone, somewhere, is listening, recording, archiving people's lives without their knowledge, it changes how you live. You stop trusting the silence. You stop trusting the machines. And most of all, You stop walking too close to the fence. I was in the final year of my geology degree when I chose to spend my last field project mapping minor fault lines in a small rural valley in the south. My supervisor told me about the area after another student dropped out. It was a long stretch of farmland bordered by limestone cliffs and old hills, mostly quiet and barely touched by tourists. A small town sat at one end, with scattered houses, a disused quarry, and a forgotten cemetery that dated back 2 centuries. I wasn't interested in cemeteries. I was interested in rocks, especially the sedimentary sequences that revealed the history of faulting in the region. According to old surveys, there were tight shear zones and brittle fractures running underneath the fields. Some connected to deeper fault systems, others ended abruptly. That was what I wanted to see up close. There were also several small caves or tunnels where the rock had opened up over time, and I hoped they would give me a clearer picture. I arrived in early September. The weather was dry, but not too warm. I stayed in a cheap room above a hardware store. The owner gave me a key, barely looked at me, and reminded me that there wasn't much to do in the area. That was fine. I came to work, not to socialize. I brought my own gear: maps, chalk, headlamp, gloves, notebook, laptop, ground microphone, and a basic seismograph. My plan was to walk the hills and mark the faults by hand, then cross-reference them with vibration readings in the evenings. The first few days went smoothly. I followed surface fractures, noted changes in bedding planes, and cataloged minor slips. Some areas were easy to reach, others required crawling through narrow rock gaps. I mostly worked alone, but occasionally farmers passed nearby, nodding without a word. One of them watched me from a distance for a while near the edge of the cemetery, but didn't say anything. I didn't mind. People in small towns like their silence. By the 4th day, I began exploring a series of shallow tunnels at the base of a limestone hill, just below the old cemetery. The graveyard itself was fenced off, but barely maintained. The stones were weathered and illegible. The air was dry, and the only sound was the wind or the distant groan of quarry machinery far off in the valley. The quarry was still operational on a limited basis. They ran machinery only during the day, and only from mid-morning to early afternoon. You could hear the deep drumming sounds from almost anywhere in the valley. I picked a small tunnel that seemed natural, a result of erosion and fault widening, not human carving. It was tight, but walkable in some places, crawlable in others. I carried my headlamp and microphone, just in case the tunnel was deeper than it looked. On the second crawl in, I heard something strange, a kind of whisper. Not a word I could understand, not even a language, more like the shape of a word without the content. It was soft and quick, like breath against dry stone. I paused and turned off the headlamp. Total darkness. The sound was gone. I turned the light back on. Nothing moved. I waited. I thought maybe wind had come through a gap above. I crawled back out and circled the hill. I couldn't find any vent or fissure that connected through. The area above was solid. I chalked it up to maybe hearing my own breath or some trick of the acoustics. The next day, I returned with the ground mic and set it down inside the tunnel. I sat still and recorded for 20 minutes. The first 15 were dead silent, but then the whisper came again, this time longer, a slow draw of sound that rose and dipped like a voice shaping syllables. I sat completely still. The microphone picked it up. I could see the tiny waves on the screen, very low frequency, almost below the threshold of normal speech. I didn't hear any wind, just that odd, dry whisper. It gave me goosebumps, even though I didn't believe in anything weird. I went back to my room and reviewed the recording. It wasn't just noise. It was organized, not a sentence, not actual speech, but close enough that the brain wanted to turn it into words. Like when you hear static that sounds like someone calling your name. My rational side told me it was just wind moving through narrow gaps. Natural tunnels often worked like flutes or organ pipes. Tight spaces can amplify or shape airflow in strange ways. But the problem was I couldn't find any entry or exit for wind to flow through. The tunnel didn't seem connected to any outer opening. I tried another tunnel 2 hills away. Same type of rock, same basic depth. Nothing. No whispers, no vibration, just silence. I returned to the first tunnel 2 more times that week. Every time around noon, I heard it again. Sometimes faint, sometimes stronger. Always around the same time. That's when I started comparing times. Noon, and I remember the quarry. They operated midday, and the machines were big. Rock cutters, crushers, hydraulic drills. If the vibrations were strong enough, they could travel through the subsurface layers and cause resonance in tight cavities. I'd read about that before, how low-frequency rumbles could activate narrow chambers in rock systems and create sounds that resembled human speech. They even tested this in labs, using sound frequencies to simulate what caves might say under stress. But I never thought I'd actually hear it in the wild. I started recording seismic readings just before noon each day. I also set up a vibration sensor right above the tunnel entrance. The pattern was clear. At 11:45, the quarry machine started up, and by 12:05, the first low-frequency pulses reached my hill. Not loud enough to hear directly, but strong enough to vibrate the limestone. At 12:10, the whisper started. At 12:25, it faded. The machine stopped at 12:30. Everything matched. I was sure it was natural. Still, it didn't explain the shape of the sound. I could accept that air moving through rock gaps created tone. But this was rhythm, intonation. Something shaped it beyond just wind. I wondered if the internal walls of the tunnel had formed tight ducts or slits that altered pitch. I decided to map the inside. I crawled in deeper, past the point where I usually turn back. I used chalk to mark the walls and laser measurements to gauge the width of the passage. That's when I found a vertical slit. It was about chest high, narrow as a coin, and ran for nearly a meter. Just beside it, the wall dipped slightly. I reached in with a gloved hand and felt cool air moving, faint but real. That was the missing link. Somewhere deeper in the rock, another tunnel or cavity was connected, and the vibration was pushing air through that slit. The opening acted like a filter, shaping the frequency and pitch of the air pulses. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. But then something strange happened. On the 7th day, the whisper changed. It started earlier, lasted longer, and sounded more distinct. Less like breath, more like someone speaking underwater. The shape of the sound was almost syllabic. My chest tightened listening to it. It was still meaningless, just raw noise, but triggered something in my brain. My subconscious kept trying to pull words from it. I left the tunnel after just 5 minutes. Back in my room, I sat with headphones on and listened again and again. It wasn't just one sound, it was a combination. Airflow, vibration, stone resonance, and possibly temperature differences inside the tunnel. I called up academic papers on natural sound formation in rock systems. Several studies confirmed the phenomenon. One in Wales found a cave that produced flute-like tones when trains passed 5 miles away. Another in Norway documented whispering walls near hydroelectric dams. So this wasn't new, just rare. I decided to write up my findings early and prepare them for publication. This was more than just a student project. This was something worth documenting. I went back one last time to take final readings. I crawled in deep, closer to the slit, and left a sensitive microphone embedded in the wall. I turned off my headlamp and sat still for 20 minutes. That's when I felt the floor shift. Just a tremor, not a collapse, not dangerous, just a subtle crack of pressure under me. I stayed calm. These tunnels were old, but not unstable. Still, I didn't want to push it. I turned my light back on and started crawling out. Just before I reached the entrance, I heard it again. The whisper. But this time, it wasn't from behind. It was beside me along the wall. The slit was vibrating, and I could see tiny bits of dust pulsing from the crack with each wave of air. I stayed long enough to capture it on camera, then left. That night, I compiled everything: photos, audio, seismic data, structural drawings. I wrote a detailed report and emailed it to my supervisor. He called it one of the most unusual natural findings he'd seen in years. He encouraged me to write a paper. The town didn't care. People there had heard stories of the whisper tunnels for generations. Most thought it was just superstition. Some thought it was the dead trying to speak. But there were no ghosts, no spirits, just rock, wind, and vibration. The quarry had been unknowingly creating this effect for decades. My data proved it. I left a few weeks later, after sealing the microphone into the tunnel for future research. They agreed I camp alone most of the time, not because I don't like people, but because they usually ruin the quiet. I started doing it back when I was a teenager, and now that I'm in my mid-30s, it's become second nature. I work in a print shop in town, 9 to 5, nothing exciting. So whenever I get a few days off, I throw my gear in the back of my truck and drive somewhere quiet. Woods, hills, even scrubland, I don't care as long as there's space and stillness. Last fall, around the end of September, I found this place just east of a veteran's cemetery. It was tucked between some rolling hills and dry brush. Not many trees, but enough to hang a tarp if the weather turned. The cemetery itself was clean and well-maintained, though small. Maybe 40 or 50 headstones, many of them old and flat to the ground. Some had little metal emblems beside them. Others had what looked like reflective plaques or mirrored tops, probably to make maintenance easier or to resist sun damage. I didn't think much of it. I camped maybe half a mile from the cemetery, close enough that I could see the tops of the tallest markers from my tent if I looked the right way. It was a good spot, dry, a bit elevated, and far enough from any road to make traffic noise non-existent. I set up my small tent, gathered some brush for a campfire, and settled in for the weekend. The first morning, I woke up to something strange. Just before sunrise, maybe 5 or 10 minutes before the light actually broke over the horizon, I heard a whisper. It wasn't a voice I could place. It didn't sound like a person nearby or like someone talking to themselves. It was more like a command. Sharp, direct, just one word, maybe two. At first I thought it was my imagination. You sleep out in the open long enough, your mind starts turning little sounds into things they're not. But I sat up in my sleeping bag anyway and listened. Nothing. I got up, walked around a bit, stretched and forgot about it. Cooked some eggs over the fire. Hiked a few miles into the hills. Took photos of some rocks and lizards. Normal stuff. But the next morning it happened again. Only this time, I was already half awake when it came. The sun wasn't up yet. The sky was that flat dark blue that comes just before dawn. Then I heard it, hold. That was it. Just one word, clear as day, like someone had whispered it directly beside my ear, only there was no one there. I sat up fast, heart racing, trying to figure out where it came from. No wind, no birds, just silence. I walked around my camp slowly, eyes scanning the brush and the distant hills. No signs of people. I even walked toward the cemetery, thinking maybe a caretaker was nearby. Nothing. No fresh tire tracks. No sign of anyone. I circled back and chalked it up to sleep tricks again, but I wasn't sure. The third morning, it happened again. This time I heard 2 words, position hold. Again, right before sunrise. It felt like the air itself whispered it. Like it came through the wind, even though the wind wasn't moving. That creeped me out more than I like to admit. I stayed in my tent a little longer that morning. I didn't want to get up. I just lay there, ears sharp, waiting for more. But nothing else came. I decided to stay one more night, but I told myself I'd do a bit of digging. Not literal digging. I'm not crazy, but I wanted to figure out what could be causing it. I've always had a fascination with signals and tech and stuff like that. As a teenager, I'd messed around with shortwave radios. I even tried building a crystal radio once. It worked barely. That day, I hiked up one of the nearby hills to see if maybe there was something that could be transmitting sound. Maybe a hidden speaker system for ceremonies at the cemetery? It sounded stupid even in my head, but I checked anyway. The hills around there were dry and scrubby. Old military fencing was rusting in a few spots, though nothing looked actively guarded or maintained. I reached the top of the nearest ridge around noon. I could see the cemetery clearly from up there. From that angle, the mirrored plaques on the graves reflected the sun sharply, like little flashes of white scattered across the field. That's when I noticed something strange. At the far edge of the hill, behind a tall patch of thorny brush, was a weathered service path, half hidden and overgrown. I followed it carefully. About a quarter mile down, I found a gate. Chain link, padlocked. On the other side, I could see the edge of a low concrete structure built into the side of the hill. It looked like a bunker or maybe an old storage facility. No windows, no signs, just faded paint and an old dish antenna half tilted on its side. The gate had no camera, no motion sensor, nothing fancy. But it didn't feel right. The padlock looked newer than the fence, like someone had replaced it not long ago. I crouched down and waited for a few minutes, just to see if anything moved. Nothing did. It was silent. Eventually, I walked back down and returned to my camp. But now I couldn't stop thinking about that place. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the bunker, the whisper, the reflected flashes of light from the grave markers. I started wondering if they were connected. So the next morning, I set an alarm. I want to be wide awake before dawn. I climbed a little way up a slope near my camp, maybe 200 feet higher than the cemetery. I took my binoculars and just sat, staring across the field of graves. Just before sunrise, it happened again. The first light came. A soft red glow touched the mirrored tops of some of the grave markers. Then I saw it, movement, not at the cemetery, but on the hill where the old bunker was. A short flash of light, like a signal mirror catching the sun. Then another, quick and rhythmic, not random. And right then, I heard the whisper again, move left. It was clear, crisp. My heart jumped. I scanned the area near the bunker again and saw nothing. But then I looked back toward the cemetery, and something clicked. The grave markers weren't just decorative. Some of them had mirror finish panels that were angled slightly up and east. And as the sun rose, those panels started reflecting sunlight toward my direction. And more importantly, toward the valley below, near the base of the hill with the hidden facility. Light signals. Old school military signaling used mirrors and flashes for communication, especially in rough terrain. But light can't carry sound. So how was I hearing voices? That's what kept spinning in my head, until I remembered something from years ago, a radio trick. Sound can travel along open radio channels if conditions are right. If a facility nearby was broadcasting commands through an unsecured frequency, and if those grave markers were polished just right, and if something nearby had the right conditions to reflect or amplify audio, it could technically echo across short distances, especially in valleys, like sound bouncing between walls. That night, I stayed up late, scanning local frequencies with a small emergency radio I kept in my bag. Around 4 a.m., I picked up a burst of static, followed by clipped audio. I turned the dial slightly and caught the tail end of voice, clear, cold, commanding. Scan complete, target stable, standby. Then silence. My stomach sank. This wasn't some open channel for civilians. It wasn't an FM station or a ham radio operator. It sounded like military coordination, but there were no bases around here. No active outposts. I would have seen fencing, signs, anything. I started digging more. I drove into town and used the library computer to look up old land use records. Turns out that hill near the cemetery had been a training site in the 1970s and early 80s. A place to test communications in difficult terrain. Underground structures were built for command simulation, and the site was shut down, or supposedly was. I went back to camp one last time. I couldn't leave it alone. I had to be sure. That morning, I stood in the same spot before sunrise. This time I had a directional mic with me, something I bought years ago to record birdsong, but never really used. I aimed it toward the cemetery, just in case. The sun came. The markers flashed. And then more commands. Advance. 2 clicks east. Scan complete. I checked the recording. The voice was there, crystal clear, and on the same frequency I'd picked up earlier. But when I looked up again, I noticed something new. A small drone, maybe the size of a dinner plate, hovered briefly over the far hill, then disappeared down behind the slope. Silent, quick. If I'd blinked, I would have missed it. That's when it all clicked. The hill housed an active military training facility. A hidden one. They were running drone simulations and remote ops using live radio commands. But they weren't careful about bleed. Some of their transmissions were echoing into the open. And the mirrored markers, old polished plaques, were catching the morning sun and, through sheer accident of angle and geography, were bouncing audio in strange ways. The valley formed a natural funnel for sound. The mirrored plaques, angled just right, reflected not just light, but created interference patterns that acted like audio reflectors. When the conditions were perfect, sunrise, clear air, and stillness, you could hear the commands that were meant only for machines. I packed up camp that day. I didn't want to get too close to the facility. I didn't want to risk crossing any lines legally, or I had been trying to get away from everything. Work had piled up, deadlines had started to feel like pressure cookers, and the noise of the city never let up, not even at night. I didn't want anything extreme. I wasn't into group hikes or resorts. I just wanted space, something quiet, somewhere I could think without always hearing traffic, people yelling into their phones, or some neighbor's kid practicing drums at midnight. So I packed up the basics: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, a cooler, camera, notebooks, and headed out of my truck. I didn't go anywhere famous. I found a spot through an old camper's forum. It wasn't even on most maps, just a flat patch of public land about a mile from an abandoned graveyard in a wooded area. The posts were old, a few years back, but one guy had said it was the quietest place he'd ever camped. No rangers, no hikers, just birds, breeze, and the crunch of your own boots. That sounded perfect. I drove about 6 hours to get there. The last 40 minutes were on rough dirt roads that hadn't seen maintenance in a long time. Grass grew in the middle. A few spots made me slow to a crawl where the tires might have caught on the roots. But the trees eventually opened, and I found the clearing. It was dry, some pine needles on the ground, a few broken branches, and enough flat space for my tent. From there, I could see the tree line stretching off both sides. Behind it, the graveyard was supposedly not far, but I didn't go looking right away. I was more interested in setting up camp, unpacking, and checking how far out my signal dropped. I had no service. That was fine. That was the point. The first night was uneventful. Just the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, and some small animal sniffing around near my cooler. I wasn't scared. I'd camped before. Nothing unusual. I slept solidly. In the morning, I boiled water for coffee and watched steam rise against the cold air. There were no people, no vehículos, not even the sound of a plane overhead. It was so quiet, it actually made my ears ring a little. I stayed there for 4 days. I took short walks, sat in a folding chair with my notebook, made sketches, took some photos. I tried to write, but mostly ended up jotting down observations. How the wind moved the treetops, how the light changed around 5:30 p.m. when the sun dropped below a ridge, how it was so dark at night, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. But on the 5th night, something woke me up around 2 a.m. It was a voice. At first I thought I had dreamt it. Just a man's voice, distant, like someone giving instructions. It didn't make sense. Nobody should have been out there. I stayed in my sleeping bag for a while listening. Then it happened again. A clear, short sentence like something out of a radio. Maintain forward position. Switch to secondary pattern. I sat up. There were no lights. No footsteps. No rustling. Just that cold voice again, robotic in its rhythm. Confirm target acquisition. I didn't hear anything else after that. I didn't go outside right away. I told myself it had to be something carried in from far away, maybe a CB radio from a trucker or something military from a base I didn't know was nearby. But it felt close. Too close. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of my site. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks. No gear missing. Just a strange feeling in my chest like I'd brushed up against something I didn't fully understand. I didn't leave. Instead, I made coffee and tried to forget it. Told myself it might have been a dream. Maybe it was a leftover sound in my brain for some podcast I'd listened to before the trip. But then the next night, it happened again. This time, it was louder. At 1:50 a.m., I heard a static burst, like the start of a walkie-talkie transmission. Then a voice, clear and crisp. Red team, sweep north section. Maintain silent mode. Begin interval scan. It sounded like it was coming from the woods past the graveyard. I didn't sleep that night. I laid there with my boots still on, hand wrapped around my flashlight like a weapon, trying not to breathe too loud. I didn't hear footsteps or see any lights, just silence. But I kept thinking, why would someone be out here running military-style drills? And why at night? I started asking questions once I got back in a cell range 2 days later. I didn't tell anyone I'd heard voices. I just asked around about whether the area had ever been used for military training. One guy in a local bar told me about some private contractor that had tested communications equipment nearby years ago. Another said he'd seen weird lights in the sky out there, but assumed it was drones. That stuck with me. I started digging. Old news articles, forums, even old land survey maps. That's when I noticed something strange. A large rectangular plot about 2 miles east of the cemetery was marked as public buffer zone, but it was boxed in with land marked under a company name I didn't recognize, Cerberus Technologies. No website, no phone number, just a registration tag and coordinates. A week later, I went back. I told myself it was just curiosity, but really, I needed to hear the voices again. I needed proof it wasn't in my head. This time, I brought more gear: night vision camera, a portable audio recorder, and a rangefinder. I parked in the same clearing and hiked to the edge of the graveyard during daylight. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 50 headstones, some of them cracked or toppled. No pods, just weeds and moss. Nothing out of the ordinary. But from there I saw something new, a trail. Not a footpath, not made by animals. It looked like something mechanical had passed through repeatedly. The grass was crushed in twin rows, like ruts or maybe landing skids. I followed it. About a mile in, I saw fencing. Not chain link, something newer. Matte black metal, about 10 feet tall, topped with what looked like motion sensors. No signs, no lobos, just a gate with a keypad and a sealed camera dome above it. I didn't go in. I didn't even get close. But I waited. That night, I set up my camera aimed toward the fence line and placed my audio recorder near the trail. I sat in my tent, awake again at 2 a.m., heart pounding. I didn't hear voices this time. I heard something worse. A low hum, mechanical, like a swarm of bees. Then a sharp click, maybe relays engaging, followed by several short bursts of audio. Execute pattern delta. Switch target skin mode. Visual anomaly detected. The voice repeated again. Then again. It glitched. Visual anomaly detected. Visual anomaly. Anomaly detected. Detected. It didn't sound human anymore. The next morning, I checked the recorder. The voice was there just like I heard it. But the creepy part was something else. A soft, buzzing background sound, almost like a fast whirring blade. When I boosted the volume, I could hear the click of motors repositioning. That's when it hit me. Drones. But not normal drones. These weren't camera drones sold in stores. These were something else. Something with built-in speakers. Something that could move almost silently through trees. Something with voice recognition. Maybe. I went home and spent 2 weeks analyzing the audio. I found bursts of encoded signals, shortwave data blips layered between the spoken commands. I matched one of the phrases to a military training manual archived online. Maintain forward position was part of a section on autonomous targeting simulations. That's when I started realizing what was happening. There wasn't a person speaking those lines. It was software. Software inside drones running a looped simulation. But something had gone wrong. Instead of being isolated to their test range, some of them had crossed into the forest. Maybe the fence didn't cover everything. Maybe there were no physical limits, just GPS coordinates they were supposed to follow. But something had caused a glitch. A bug, maybe, or a corrupted file. The drones didn't know where they were anymore. They kept repeating the same commands, maybe looking for something that didn't exist. I started seeing them after that. Always between 2 and 3 a.m., small dark shapes overhead. No lights, just a soft clicking sound, like a camera lens adjusting. Sometimes I'd hear the phrase "acquire target" whispered so low it made my skin crawl. I stopped camping, but I couldn't stop thinking. I kept researching Cerberus Technologies. They had no online presence, but one leaked document I found referenced autonomous voice command drone trials connected to a subcontractor that had been fined for unlicensed operations in rural testing corridors. That sealed it for me. They were testing drones that could mimic voices, issue commands, maybe even respond to certain sounds. But the programming had gone haywire. Some of the drones had wandered off course. And out in those woods, they were still running, still waiting for commands that never came. I reported everything, audio, footage, location, to a watchdog group. Nothing came of it. A few weeks later, their site went dark. I tried emailing a journalist. He said it was interesting, but without more physical proof, no one would touch it. Too risky. Too many legal gray areas. So I stopped pushing. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, windows down, I still think I hear it. A soft static buzz. And then, just before it cuts out completely, Target acquired. It started in early spring, just when the days were getting longer and the rains had begun to slack off. I had picked up a short-term job through a contractor who handled historical restorations. Churches, graveyards, war memorials, that kind of thing. The gig was in a small town about 45 minutes from where I lived. They needed some repair work done on an old stone mausoleum that had been sitting at the back of a neglected cemetery for years. It was one of those jobs no one really wanted, quiet, lonely, low-paying, and mostly about clearing brush, patching stonework, and replacing a busted iron gate. But I didn't mind. I liked working alone, and it sounded peaceful. When I first got there, I was struck by how overgrown the place was. The path leading through the cemetery was cracked and covered in weeds. Tall grass had overtaken the old headstones. Some were leaning, some had fallen over completely. It looked like no one had visited the place in a long time. The mausoleum stood at the far end, under a canopy of tall oaks. It was made of gray stone, maybe limestone, with a flat roof and two narrow windows on each side. Just slits, really. A rusted gate covered the entrance, locked shut with a heavy chain. The door behind it was solid stone. Ivy had crept over most of the structure, and a mortar was crumbling in several places. My job was straightforward. Clear the vegetation, patch the stonework, replace some missing roof tiles, and install a new gate. The inside wasn't part of the contract. It was sealed shut, and the record said no one had been buried in there for over 60 years. It was a family tomb, but the family had apparently died out. There was no one left to claim the place. The local council just wanted to preserve it as a historical structure, not for any sentimental reason, just so it wouldn't become a liability. The first few days were uneventful. I came in early, worked through the day, ate my lunch on the stone steps, and left by sunset. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't get cell service there, so there were no distractions. I had a battery-powered radio, but I stopped bringing it after the second day because the reception was awful and the static annoyed me more than the silence. There weren't many animals either. No birds nesting in the trees, no squirrels running through the brush, just the occasional rustle in the grass that was probably a rabbit or a stray cat. On the fourth day, I started hearing the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I was chiseling out some cracked mortar on the side of the mausoleum when I noticed a faint whispering. I paused, thinking maybe someone was nearby, but when I looked around, the cemetery was empty. I figured it was just leaves rustling or some trick of the wind through the window slits. But then it happened again later that afternoon. Soft murmurs, too low to make out any words, but steady and strange. I looked up at the trees. Nothing was moving. I walked around the mausoleum, but there was no one there. That night, I didn't think too much about it. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe something echoing through the structure. Old buildings can make odd sounds. Stone and metal hold vibrations in weird ways. But the next day, the whispers returned. I was working on a crack in the front steps when I heard them again, clearer this time, like voices just on the other side of the wall. It sounded like several people talking at once, overlapping. Still too quiet to understand, but unmistakably voices. I pressed my ear to the stone door, and I swear I could hear them directly behind it. I stepped back and stared at the door for a while. It was still sealed shut. The chain around the gate was rusted solid. The lock was covered in grime and obviously hadn't been touched in years. I tried pushing on the gate, just in case. It didn't budge. The voices stopped after a minute or two. I waited another 10 minutes, but they didn't return. I went back to work, feeling uneasy but telling myself it had to be something logical, maybe sound from a distant road or house bouncing through the trees, or something trapped inside that was making noise, like an animal. By the end of the week, I was hearing the whispers regularly, always coming from the inside of the mausoleum, always when I was near it. I started to dread being close to it. I began spending more time on the roof and less time near the door. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the voices. I didn't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But the feeling I got standing near that door wasn't just nerves. It felt deliberate, like someone knew I was there, like they were talking to me. One morning I arrived early, earlier than usual. The sun had barely come up, and the cemetery was bathed in a cold blue light. Dew clung to the grass, and a light fog drifted between the graves. I approached the mausoleum and noticed something odd. The chain around the gate looked like it had been moved. It wasn't hanging the way it had been the day before. It had been twisted slightly, and one of the links had a shiny spot, like it had been rubbed recently. I crouched down and examined the lock. The grime was still there, but I saw faint scratches around the keyhole. It looked fresh. That was when I began to think someone was messing with me. Maybe local kids. Maybe someone who knew I was working there alone and thought it'd be funny to play games. The cemetery wasn't fenced off, and the town wasn't far. Anyone could sneak in at night. I told myself that was the explanation I was going to settle on. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on inside that mausoleum, it was meant to be noticed. And I was noticing it. Over the next few days, I started hearing other things, strange clicks, hums, and what sounded like static. It wasn't constant, just occasional, usually in the afternoons when the sun was at its peak. The whispers continued too. Sometimes I heard what sounded like a laugh. Short, sharp, and unnatural. That one unsettled me more than anything. It didn't sound joyful. It sounded artificial, like a recording. Eventually, I decided I needed to see inside. Not out of curiosity anymore, but because I was beginning to feel watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, always near the trees or behind the graves. But when I turned, nothing was there. I started keeping a hammer on my belt, not because I expected to use it, but because it made me feel less exposed. I knew I had to figure out what was happening inside that tomb, even if it meant going beyond what I was supposed to be doing. I went into town and bought a bolt cutter. The next morning, before I started any other work, I cut the chain. It took more effort than I expected. The links were thick and rusted, and I had to brace myself against the gate to get enough force. The chain snapped with a loud clang that echoed across the cemetery. I hesitated for a long moment, then pushed the gate open. It groaned on its hinges and swung inward, revealing the stone door. There was no handle, just a carved indentation where one might have been long ago. I pressed my palms against it and pushed. It didn't move. I got my pry bar and wedged it into the side where a crack in the mortar had formed. After some struggling, I managed to shift the door a few inches. Dust poured out from the gap. I kept working at it until I had enough room to slip inside. The air inside was cold and stale, thick with the smell of damp stone and old wood. I turned on my flashlight and stepped in. The interior was small, maybe 15 by 15 feet, with a vaulted ceiling and 4 stone coffins placed symmetrically around a central pillar. The floor was covered in dust and dead leaves, probably blown in through the narrow window, slits over the years. But that wasn't what caught my eye. Mounted in the corners of the ceiling were black plastic boxes, about the size of shoebox, with wires running between them and a central metal box placed behind the pillar. My stomach tightened. I recognized the setup. They were speakers, high-frequency directional speakers, the kind used in museums or art installations. The wires led to an old digital audio player tucked inside the metal box. It was still running, powered by a long-lasting lithium battery, maybe solar rechargeable. There was a motion sensor mounted near the doorway. I stood there for a minute, breathing slowly, my flashlight aimed at the system. I finally understood what had been happening. Someone had set this up to play sounds, whispers, static clicks, maybe even laughter whenever someone approached the tomb. The motion sensor would trigger the player, which would then feed the signal to the speakers. The high-frequency speakers would project sound narrowly, so it would only be audible near the door and only to someone standing in a certain spot. That's why I only heard it when I was close. I turned off the player and pulled the speakers down one by one. The installation wasn't recent. The plastic was coated in dust, and some of the wire casings had started to crack with age. The audio player had a cracked screen, but I could still make out the file names. Things like whisper_track_4.wave and laugh_2.mp3. It was clear someone had gone to a lot of effort to make this place seem haunted. It must have been years ago. Maybe a group of local kids or amateur ghost hunters had broken in, set this up for kicks, and then never came back. Maybe they wanted to scare friends or attract thrill seekers. I don't know, but they had succeeded. Even years later, it had done its job. It had convinced me something unnatural was happening. I left the equipment on the ground and sat on the stone steps outside for a long time, just breathing in the warm air and listening to the birds, which I now noticed had returned. I walk the same route every Sunday. Not because I have to, not because I even want to, but because I need it. It keeps me grounded, helps me breathe, helps me not think too much about the things that used to keep me up at night. Most people avoid cemeteries, but I've always found them peaceful. When you live alone, you start craving quiet. I guess I've made peace with the dead more than the living. The cemetery is just 2 blocks from my flat, tucked between an old church and a row of silent, crumbling houses. It's not maintained well. The iron gates are rusted, half hanging off the hinges, and the path is uneven, covered in dry leaves and patches of brittle grass. But it's quiet. Still, you can hear yourself think here. I like that. I always bring my dog, Teddy. He's not much of a guard dog, just a quiet mutt with a crooked tail and ears that never stand straight. He doesn't bark or chase. He just walks next to me, sniffing the ground, sometimes nudging my calf when he wants a treat. We walk in a loop, past the older gravestones with the names, mostly worn off, past the newer headstones where the flowers are still fresh, and then circle back out. That Sunday started the same way. The air was dry. It hadn't rained for 2 weeks, and the grass crunched under my boots. I remember noticing how the earth seemed drier than usual, like it had been baked under the sun. Teddy was more interested than usual in sniffing around the edges of the graves, nose deep in the cracks between stone and dirt. I didn't think much of it. It was near the back of the cemetery, close to where the tree thickens and the graves get older, that I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, faint, just under the surface of silence. But then I heard it again. A noise, a tiny sound that didn't belong, like a whimper, muffled, not an animal, not the wind. It was too rhythmic. It had a pattern, a shape. I froze. Teddy's ears twitched. He stood still too. Then he moved toward one of the plots. It wasn't a headstone I recognized. It was older, not ancient, but faded. The ground around it was slightly raised, like it had been disturbed. The grass hadn't grown back fully. There were tiny ridges along the surface, like someone had dug it up at some point and packed the soil back down hastily. That's when I heard the noise again. Clearer this time. A soft, high-pitched crackle followed by what sounded like a cry. A baby's cry. Not loud, not frantic, dull, muffled, but definitely a baby. Every part of me tensed. I looked around the cemetery. Empty. No other walkers. No cars nearby. The trees didn't move. There was no wind. I crouched next to the grave and put my ear closer to the soil. There was again soft static, then the faint sound of a baby crying, followed by something else. What sounded like the rustle of movement, a soft thud, and then silence. I stood up and took a step back. Logic tried to talk me down. Maybe someone had left a speaker nearby. Maybe it was a prank. But I couldn't ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. I didn't have a shovel, but the soil was loose. It crumbled easily under my fingers. I dug quickly, clawing through the top layer, ignoring how dry and rough it felt against my nails. Teddy sat beside me, still watching, still listening. The sound didn't stop. The static came and went like a weak signal. I kept going. It wasn't deep. Just under the first foot of dirt, I hit something hard. Plastic. Rectangular. I brushed the soil off. It was a baby monitor. Old, scratched, dusty, with a faint blinking red light on the side. The speaker was slightly cracked, but it was on. Still working. Somehow, I picked it up, hands trembling, and held it close. Static. Then silence. Then the soft sound of voices. Distant. Not in the cemetery. Household sounds. A cupboard closing. Footsteps. A child babbling. A low hum like a TV in another room. It was active. It was connected. I stood there, blinking down at it. My breath felt thin, like I had to work to pull it in. The monitor wasn't buried deeply. Someone had placed it there, or left it behind, but it was still working. That didn't make sense. I took it home. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to leave it there. It felt wrong. I wrapped it in an old towel and placed it on the kitchen counter. I watched it for an hour. Listened. More sounds came through. A child laughing. A vacuum cleaner. A dog barking distantly. No voices I could identify, just the ambient sounds of a normal house. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I started digging online. I looked up the cemetery records. It took some work. Most of them weren't digitized. I ended up walking to the municipal records office. I gave him the name on the headstone, M. Deering. The woman behind the counter pulled out an old binder. She found a record. Margaret Deering died 10 years ago. Her daughter, apparently, had brought her infant to the funeral. It was a small service. The baby monitor had been in the diaper bag, used to keep an ear on the baby while they lower the casket. They left it behind by accident. That's what the report said. Someone else probably kicked some dirt over it at some point, unintentionally burying it. No one had come back for it. No one knew it was there. That explained how it got into the ground. But it didn't explain why it was still on, or why it was connected. I flipped the monitor over and looked at the model number. It was an older unit, the kind that auto-pairs to any matching model on the same frequency band. I found a user manual online. According to it, if another unit with the same encryption-free signal was nearby, within a certain radius, it could latch onto the stronger one and begin receiving its transmission. It was rare but not impossible. I started thinking. There were houses around the cemetery. Old houses. Some probably had families. Some might have babies. Someone out there, nearby, must be using the same model. And the signal jumped. That's why I'd heard a baby crying. That's why I'd heard footsteps and background noise. The monitor had locked onto someone else's signal. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a buried child or a ghost. It was an old, forgotten device, still functioning long after it should have died. I wanted to confirm it. Needed to. I charged the unit with an old adapter I found in a thrift shop. Left it on. Every hour or so, new sounds came through. A song playing. A kettle whistling. What sounded like the creak of a door. Then silence. Then faint murmuring. Never words. Just low human noise, like life humming behind a wall. One evening, around 7 p.m., I heard something different. A chime, like a microwave. Then footsteps. Quick, heavy. Then a door slam. Then crying again. Louder. Longer. The sound were vivid. Too vivid. I found myself holding my breath, listening harder. It felt invasive, like I was inside someone's home. But I couldn't stop. The next day, I walked the area around the cemetery, looking at the houses, trying to guess which one might be using the same model. I didn't knock. Didn't speak to anyone. Just walked slowly, dog leash in hand, watching for signs. Baby toys, diaper bins, window blinds left cracked open. I didn't find anything. I came home and wrapped the monitor in a towel again. Tucked it away in a drawer. I thought maybe I could forget it, but I couldn't. Every night I pulled it out. Every night the sounds came back. Quiet, subtle, sometimes cheerful, sometimes not. Over the weeks, I noticed something else. The sounds followed a pattern. Same times every day. Same sequence. A cry at 6:15 p.m. A chime at 7. The sound of something being dragged, maybe a chair, at 9. Then silence. Then a door opening at 11:30. Every single night. It wasn't a live feed. It was a loop. The monitor was playing back a save loop, not a real-time broadcast. Somehow, the monitor had stored a block of audio and was transmitting it again and again. Or maybe the other unit, the one it had paired with, was locked into a playback loop. I didn't know enough about the technology to be sure, so I called a retired electronics tech I found in a forum. I didn't mention the cemetery, just told him I'd found an old monitor and wanted to know how it could still be running. He explained that old baby monitors with analog components sometimes had basic memory circuits. If the transmitting unit was tampered with or damaged, it might cycle the last received data packet repeatedly. It was a glitch, not a feature. Rare, but not unheard of. That's what had happened. During the funeral, the receiving unit had likely been dropped into the dirt with the power still on. The transmitter left in someone's bag, still on, still active. At some point, maybe the transmitter was damaged or turned off or removed entirely. But before that, the receiving unit stored the last batch of audio and, due to a hardware fault, began cycling it every time it powered up. It wasn't alive. It wasn't real time. It was just broken hardware playing back a slice of life over and over again. A moment trapped in plastic. I couldn't stop thinking about that. How many other objects out there were still replaying the same old echoes? I buried the monitor again. I didn't feel right keeping it. Not because I was scared, but because it didn't belong with me. I went back to the same plot, dug a little hole, placed the monitor back inside, covered it with the same dry soil. I didn't hear the cries again. Maybe the battery finally gave out. Maybe the signal weak. I started going to the cemetery every morning around the end of October. It was always cold by then, but something about that place during early fog hours pulled me in. As a freelance photographer, I usually chased moments, shadows on water, wind in trees, the way sunlight cut through broken things. But this graveyard, quiet and forgotten on the edge of town, gave me something else. It gave me stillness. Everything about it felt untouched, slow, patient. The fog was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't like normal fog. It started rolling in just before dawn and would hang low and thick across the cemetery grounds, clinging to headstones and iron fences. It was heavier than anything I'd seen in open fields or valleys. It felt like it belonged to that graveyard, as if it lived there and nowhere else. I tried to capture it each day, how it curled up against statues, how it glowed with that first thin light, how it moved when nothing else did. On the third or fourth morning, I heard something strange. It was soft, almost too soft to notice at first. I had my camera up, focusing on an angel statue that had lost part of its wing, when I heard what I thought was a woman crying. Not sobbing or screaming, just faint cries, long and low, like someone trying not to be heard. I lowered the camera and looked around. The fog was thick that morning. I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I waited, listening, holding my breath. It stopped, and it came back, softer this time. I moved slowly toward the sound. It wasn't coming from the graves. It seemed to drift in with the fog itself. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the wind made strange patterns through the trees, or maybe I was picking up sound from the nearby road. Still, it unsettled me. That morning, I packed up earlier than usual. Over the next few weeks, I kept returning. The cries didn't stop. In fact, some mornings I could swear I heard words distorted and pulled apart like they were coming through layers of water. Most of the time, it was too faint to make anything out, just vague syllables mixed with long, drawn-out sighs. Other times it sounded like laughter. Not the joyful kind, the dry, tired kind that you don't want to be near. I didn't tell anyone at first. I didn't want to sound dramatic, but something about it stuck to me. I started staying later into the morning, hoping the fog would lift enough to reveal some logical answer. I checked the trees. I looked behind every stone. I even searched for speakers, maybe a prank or some weird public art installation. Nothing. Just grass, stone, silence, and the slow breath of fog rolling in and out like waves. The only clue I had came by accident. I'd taken a photo of the far edge of the cemetery, down past the oldest gravestones. When I got home and blew it up on my screen, I noticed a small rectangular shape half hidden in the mist. I hadn't seen it with my eyes. It looked like a shed or small building tucked into the woods. The next day, I brought a longer lens and focused in that direction. Sure enough, there it was, a glass structure just barely visible beyond the rusted fence line. The following morning, I left early and walked the long way around the graveyard fence until I found it. It was a greenhouse, old but working. The glass was fogged, and there was condensation on the inside, like it was generating a lot of heat. A thick pipe, maybe 6 inches wide, ran out from the back of the structure and disappeared into the ground, heading in the direction of the cemetery. That was the first time I felt something close to fear, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe all that strange fog, all those soft cries and warped noises, weren't coming from the graveyard itself. They were coming through it. I went back every day after that, not just to the cemetery now, but to the greenhouse. I tried to get closer, but it was fenced off and locked. No signs, no workers, no posted hours. Just glass, humming equipment, and the steady whir of fans pushing warm air out through that underground pipe. One day, I stayed later than usual and waited near the edge of the greenhouse property. Around 10 a.m., I heard the sound of an engine and crouched behind a patch of brush. A small utility truck pulled up and a man in a green jacket climbed out. He unlocked the greenhouse and went inside. I couldn't see much from where I was, but after about 30 minutes, he came back out, locked it again, and drove off. That told me something important. Someone maintained it. The next day, I followed the pipe more carefully. It ran through a patch of woods, under a slope, and into the far corner of the cemetery, where the fog was always thickest. I found a patch of disturbed earth and pulled away a few dead leaves. Avant, just a flat metal grate, slightly warm to the touch. The pipe ended there, and warm air drifted up through it. I could feel it on my face. That's when I heard the crying again. This time it was clearer. It was a woman's voice, and she was saying something like "stay away" or "stay awake." I couldn't tell. Then the sound shifted like a radio tuner moving through stations. I heard a loud advertisement, something about a tire change or oil deal. Then it cut into a conversation between two people, muffled and warped like they were underwater. Then back to the cries. Then silence. I stared at that vent for a long time. Everything started to make sense in a sick kind of way. That greenhouse wasn't just warming plants. It was venting heat through the graveyard. And that pipe wasn't just moving air. It was carrying sound, snippets of radio stations, human voices, background chatter. And when it mixed with fog and temperature drops and dense air pressure, it twisted those sounds into something else. Something human-like. Something ghost-like. I wasn't hearing the dead. I was hearing the town. But I didn't stop going. If anything, I got more obsessed. I started recording the sounds. I set up a small audio recorder near the vent and left it there for hours. When I played it back, the results were terrifying in a different way. You could hear the way the air stretched voices, softened consonants, and echoed laughter in slow, slurred loops. It created something deeply unnatural out of normal life. I started sleeping badly. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard that same crying through my apartment vents. I moved my bed away from the walls. I started wearing headphones to sleep. I didn't tell anyone, not even the guy at the camera shop who processed my film and noticed I hadn't submitted a normal landscape photo in weeks. One morning, I noticed someone had moved the vent. It was slightly to the left of where it had been. The metal around it looked cleaner, like someone had wiped it. That same day, I saw fresh footprints near the greenhouse gate. Heavy boots. Whoever was running that place knew the sounds were leaking. That night, I broke in. I waited until after midnight and walked the long way around, using a flashlight with red film over it. The lock on the greenhouse gate was old. I managed to snap it with bolt cutters I borrowed from a friend under the excuse I was fixing something at home. Inside, the air was thick and wet. Rows of plants lined metal tables, tomatoes, herbs, something viney I didn't recognize. The place smelled earthy, sharp chemical. But what caught my attention wasn't the plants. It was the speaker system. Small black speakers were mounted in each corner, connected to a central console. There were wires everywhere. Radios, tuners, signal boosters. Someone was running multiple channels of sound at once. I checked the console. It was old but active, dials moving, green lights blinking. I hit playback on the main unit. Instantly, I heard the crying, then the commercial, then the muffled voices. There was a folder on the desk with handwritten notes. Dates, times, sound conditions, weather readings, humidity levels. At the top, it said, Oral Dispersion Study, Phase 2. Some university logo was half torn off the paper. It wasn't a greenhouse. It was a sound experiment. They were testing how audio moved through different types of air and pressure systems. The fog, the piping, the warped voices, all of it was part of an experiment. And no one had told the town. No one had told the people buried in that cemetery. No one told me. I left everything as I found it. Locked the gate. Walked home. I didn't go back the next morning, or the morning after, but I kept hearing it. Through my window, through the pipes in my apartment, through the static on my car radio. I moved a few months later. I told myself it was because of rent, but that wasn't true. I had money saved. I left because I couldn't unhear it. The fog, the voices, the crying that wasn't crying. I tried to tell myself it was all explainable. Just sound bouncing through air. Just science. But some things don't sit well even when they make sense. Some mornings I still wake up at dawn, even in this new place, half expecting to see fog creeping under my door. And sometimes when the wind shifts, I swear I still hear that voice, telling me to stay away. Or maybe stay awake. I don't go near greenhouses anymore. I hadn't been to that cemetery in years. I didn't even know why I went back. It wasn't like I knew anyone buried there. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was because it was one of the few places left where no one looked at a phone. The trees were older than the town, thick and knotted, with bark like dried leather. The gravestones were all sunken and slanted, many chipped, some with faded writing that took effort to read. A few graves had plastic flowers half buried in the dirt. Most had nothing. The bench caught my eye because it looked new. A big stone thing, real polished granite, darker than the rest of the headstones around it. It didn't match the old moss-covered stuff. It was shaped like a half moon, curved slightly, wide enough to fit two people comfortably. There was a name carved into the top of the backrest in bold letters. In loving memory of Alfred Burroughs, 1947 to 2021. No more words. No quote. No poem. Just that. The first time I sat on it was because I was tired. I had been walking a while, weaving between rows, looking at names I didn't recognize. The bench was cold but smooth, and it faced a small clearing surrounded by gravestones and trees. Everything was still. It was the kind of quiet you didn't notice at first, but once you did, it felt thick. No birds. Nobody's. Even the trees didn't creak. I leaned back and let out a breath, stretching my legs out. That's when I first heard it. A muttering sound, low and strange, like someone talking with their mouth full, just barely loud enough to catch. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I sat up straight and looked around. There was no one nearby. No footsteps, no rustling. I stood and walked in a slow circle, eyes scanning the edge of the woods, the gaps between gravestones. Nothing. I shrugged it off. It was probably some bug or small animal. The wind shifting under the bench, maybe. The next day, I came back. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to feel the quiet again. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it had just been in my head. I walked a different path through the cemetery, slower this time, stopping to read names, seeing if any of them struck me. Most didn't. Some graves were so old the letters had nearly disappeared. When I got to the bench again, I sat the same way, leaned back, and closed my eyes. The sound came again, louder this time, a low, thick muttering. Not words exactly, but something that sounded like them. I froze. The hairs on my arms stood up. I held my breath. Then it stopped. I sat forward slowly. Again, no one. I scanned around. There wasn't even a breeze. I looked on the bench. Just grass and dirt. I waited 5 minutes before I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back. The third day, I brought a notebook. Not because I expected to hear anything, but because I wanted something to do if I sat there. The bench had gotten under my skin somehow. It had become a puzzle. I came in the morning. The air was crisp and there was dew on the grass. A fine mist hovered low, not thick enough to block vision, but enough to make everything look softer. The bench stood just like before, dark and clean, like it had been polished recently. I sat down, leaned back, and waited. Nothing at first, just the silence. I wrote down the date and time. Then I shifted slightly, and it came again. A low muttering right behind me, like it was in the stone. I leaned forward quickly. The sound stopped. I shifted again, slowly leaning back. The sound returned. A few seconds, then gone. I did it again. Sat up, then leaned back. Sound. Always when I lean back. I wrote that down. Then I started experimenting. I leaned back faster, slower, moved my arms, breath deeply. The sound came each time, but not always the same. Sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, sometimes louder. I sat there for hours that day, noting everything. The angle of my back, the position of my arms, the depth of my breaths. I even brought a small mirror from my bag and checked the underside of the bench, but there was nothing unusual. On the fourth day, I brought a small recorder and placed it on the bench beside me. I leaned back and let the recorder capture the sound. I listened to it afterward. It didn't sound like much, just a low, breathy noise, like someone muttering far away. But it was there. That evening, I started researching echo patterns. I looked into acoustic shadows, whispering galleries, sound deflection. Most of it was above my head, but some of it made sense. Hard curved surfaces could bend sound in weird ways. Whispering walls, parabolic echoes. Some churches and monuments were built that way intentionally. The bench wasn't huge, but it was curved, and it was made of dense stone. Granite, I guessed. If there was a hollow part behind the backrest, even a small one, it could trap and reshape sound. I came back the next morning with a small flashlight and a thin metal rod. I sat down, leaned back, and let the sound play again. Then I stood up and tapped along the backrest with the rod. Most of it felt solid, but when I got to the middle part of the curve, the tone changed. Slightly hollower, not by much, but enough. I crouched low, scanning the back edge where the bench met the ground. That's when I saw it. A thin seam, barely noticeable. A narrow vertical line with a middle stone panel joined the outer ones. I pressed against it. Nothing moved, but the seam felt real. Maybe the stone was actually a thin outer shell. Maybe there was space inside. I imagined a small hollow chamber, just a few inches deep, enough to act as a sound cavity. That would explain the distortion. The curve would direct the sound into that space, and when I leaned back and exhaled, it would bounce inside and echo back in strange ways. I spent the next hour testing it. I tapped all over the bench. The sound varied slightly. The center panel always had that faint hollow quality. I even tried speaking softly while leaning back. My voice came back warped, like someone mimicking me underwater. But it wasn't anything supernatural. It was just poor construction, or maybe intentional, but not for creepy reasons. Maybe it was just a design flaw. Two pieces of stone sealed around a thin, empty space, not filled properly. Still, it didn't make the experience less unsettling. Hearing my own breath come back twisted and garbled like a whisper wasn't something I could get used to. I kept visiting though. I started to like the puzzle of it. I tried new things, placing my phone at different angles, recording the echoes, mapping out how the sound changed based on my position. I sketched the curve and noted where the seams were. One day, I brought a small rubber mallet and tapped all along the backrest, checking for consistency. Most of the bench gave back a flat, dull thud, but the center, again, gave off a higher tone. That confirmed it for me. There was definitely a cavity inside. I thought about trying to look inside, but the bench was sealed tight. I didn't want to damage anything. I wasn't trying to vandalize a memorial. I even looked up Alfred Burroughs. There wasn't much. An obituary in the local paper. Retired teacher, died at 74, survived by a wife and 2 children. Nothing unusual. I didn't know him. One afternoon, I saw a maintenance worker mowing near the edge of the cemetery. I watched him for a while, then walked over and asked if he knew who had installed the new bench. He didn't know much, just said it had been added last spring, funded by the family. Ordered from some place out of town. Nothing special. The next few visits were quiet. I didn't hear the sound as much. Maybe I was getting used to it. Or maybe the conditions had to be just right. Temperature, air pressure, angle of the sun. I didn't know, but the more I understood the bench, the less strange it seemed. What had felt eerie now made sense. It had been my own breath, my own shifting weight, creating the sound. The curve of the bench and the hollow behind the stone took those small noises and fed them back warped and slow. It was a trick of acoustics. Nothing more. I kept all my notes. I even wrote a small article about it for a local newsletter, Echoes in Stone, a cemetery bench's accidental acoustics. No one paid much attention, but I didn't care. I still visit sometimes. Not every day, but when I need quiet. I sit there and lean back and listen. Sometimes I hear it again, that low muttering, but now I smile when I hear it. It's just me, my breath, my movements bouncing through a flawed stone design. There's nothing haunted about it. No ghosts, no spirits, just poor craftsmanship and a perfect curve. Still, I always sit a little straighter when I'm there, just in case. I got the call on a Monday morning in early November. The email came from a local municipality office and was forwarded to me by the company I worked for, a small inspection and facility documentation firm. We specialized in surveying and logging conditions of abandoned or soon-to-be repurposed government buildings. Usually it was old libraries, schools, sometimes water pump houses, or fire stations. Occasionally we got more sensitive jobs, old hospitals, prisons, even crematoriums. The job was simple. Inspect the structure, take photographs, log any damage, map out what utilities were still functional, and check for any signs of trespassing or squatters. This one was listed as a decommissioned crematorium near the edge of an old graveyard just outside a small town called Belfield. The facility had been closed since the late 1980s. Since then, It had mostly sat dormant behind locked gates and thick pine growth. According to the briefing notes, the site was going to be absorbed into a nearby park expansion project. They needed to know what was still intact, what was salvageable, and what needed to be demolished. It wasn't a big deal, and the payout was decent, so I accepted it. The next morning, I drove down a company truck with the usual gear in the back: camera, laptop, flashlight, handheld spectrum scanner, a few signal detectors, portable battery pack, and my notepad. The property was about 2 hours away from the city. Most of the road was empty, and the last stretch was little more than a dirt track running along the edge of pine forest. The place was remote. I passed no cars, no joggers, just long silence broken only by the humming of tires on gravel. The entrance gate was old but intact. It had a sign bolted into the rusted mesh: Belfield Memorial Crematory. Closed. The chains on the gate had already been removed. I stepped through and followed the cracked cement path winding up the hill. On the right side, through the thinning tree line, I could see rows of neglected grave plots, some with broken headstones, others almost lost in weeds and pine needles. It was a strange sight. The trees had half swallowed everything. The main building came into view a few minutes later. It was a single-story rectangular structure made of red brick with vines growing up the west wall. The roof was sagging in a few places, and the glass on the entrance door was gone. I stepped inside, crunching on debris. The air was cold and smelled of mildew and rust. I could hear the soft drip of water somewhere further in. The layout was what I expected: waiting room, front desk, chapel area, a prep room, cremation chamber, and a few storage rooms. I began my usual procedure: take photographs of all rooms, note the condition of floors, walls, ceiling, doors. I mapped utility panels, breaker boxes, exposed plumbing, and recorded which circuits still showed residual voltage. A few light switches actually worked, surprisingly. Some rooms flickered to life with dull, amber bulbs. I spent the better part of the morning moving through the building. Around noon, I stepped out the back door to inspect the utility shed and the remnants of a loading dock. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint, like static or distant wind, but rhythmic. A low, pulsing hum. I stopped and listened. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the trees or some distant power line buzzing. But this was different. It wasn't random or soft like wind. It had a subtle beat to it, like a repeating whisper loop. It was coming from the direction of the cemetery. I walked toward the old graveyard slowly. The path between the crematorium and the grave plots was cracked and overgrown. I had to push past dry brush and some collapsed fence panels. When I got closer to the cemetery entrance, a pair of stone pillars with a rusted iron arch above, I heard it more clearly. A faint voice, whispering. No words, just tones that rose and fell like broken sentences trapped in static. The sound was coming from the base of the left pillar. I crouched and leaned closer. There was a metal plate embedded in the stone, half covered in moss. I brushed it off. It looked like some sort of intercom speaker, maybe 5 inches wide, with small vent slits and a corroded button underneath. It was dead silent for a moment. Then I heard it again, a soft whisper, garbled, like a throat clearing or a radio caught between 2 stations. I pulled out my spectrum scanner and pointed it at the wall. There was a faint electrical signal, very weak but fluctuating. Something was live. I opened my notepad and made a note. Possible buried communication device. Weak signal detected. Active static sounds. Then I noticed something else. A small wire, barely visible, ran from the back of the pillar down into the dirt. It had likely been part of an old intercom system. Back when this place was operational, maybe they used it for coordination between the gate and the building. That made sense. In the 80s, before cell phones, it wasn't unusual to install outdoor intercom units for cemetery staff. But this thing should have been long dead. I stood there for a while listening. The sound looped again, soft whispers, like a broken recording. No actual words, just garbled mouth sounds. I followed the wire trail. It disappeared into the ground, but further along the base of the cemetery wall, I noticed what looked like a small service hatch, mostly covered in dirt and pine needles. I pried it open. Underneath was a narrow concrete trench with wiring ducts and old conduit tubing. The intercom wire ran through it. I took out my flashlight and followed the path. It led about 40 feet along the wall, past several grave plots, until it reached a rusted metal junction box mounted halfway up the back of a utility pole. What caught my eye immediately was the small solar panel above it. The panel was modern, much newer than anything else around it, probably installed in the last 5 or 10 years. The panel had wires leading down into the junction box. A secondary wire trailed off into the trees behind the cemetery. I followed it. About 20 yards in, I found a pile of what looked like electronics debris. Old circuit boards, corroded batteries, cracked cases. Mixed in with it was a broken plastic housing for what used to be a small inverter. Someone had tried to rig a solar-powered power system here. And while most of it was wrecked, the main panel was still intact. Backtracking to the junction box, I used my meter to check for voltage. The thing was weakly powered, just enough to keep a low-energy circuit alive. My guess was that whoever had last used the crematorium, or maybe a later visitor, had tried to get the intercom system working again, either as part of a research project or for some kind of prank. But the power supply had degraded over time. What was left was just barely enough to activate the speaker's magnet coil, causing those whispering noises. It explained the sound, but I still wasn't sure why it looped like that. Maybe the system had been connected to an old audio tape or feedback circuit that reactivated once voltage was restored. Maybe it was just the speaker malfunctioning, vibrating due to low power flow. Regardless, it was real and not some hallucination or paranoia. Back inside the crematorium, I searched for any remaining control panels or communication units. In a back utility closet, I found an old staff panel mounted on the wall. It was covered in dust, but the labels were still readable. One was marked Gatecom. I opened the box. The inside was empty, except for one cracked relay module and a melted capacitor. The rest had been stripped out. I recorded the damage and took some pictures, then walked back toward the cemetery gate. As I approached the intercom again, it made a louder sound, a soft hiss, followed by a clicking noise. Then silence. I waited. Nothing else came. Just wind and a few birds in the trees. I stared at the speaker for a long time, then tapped on the casing lightly with the back of my flashlight. No response. Satisfied I'd figured it out, I returned to the main building and finished my documentation. I marked the buried wire path on my site diagram, labeled the intercom as reactivated through solar interference, and filed it under outdated comm systems. After a few more photographs of the cremation chamber and roof structure, I packed up. Before leaving, I walked once more past the cemetery gate. The whispers didn't return. Maybe the circuit had finally burned out, or maybe the solar panel had dropped below its minimum voltage. Either way, the noise was gone. Later, when I turned in my report, I included everything. I noted that the intercom sounds had likely been caused by residual power flowing through old speaker lines, reactivated accidentally due to makeshift solar panels. I attached pictures of the junction box, the trench, the speaker grill, and the buried wire route. The case was closed, but something about it stuck with me. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I went digging through archived maintenance records for Belfield Crematorium. I found something strange. In 1987, just a year before the facility was shut down, the cemetery staff had installed an experimental communication system linking the crematorium office, chapel, and cemetery entrance. It was designed to let staff coordinate quietly during services without disrupting ceremonies. The system used low-voltage intercoms with magnetic loop technology, a short-lived design, though. I started volunteering at the old cemetery in early spring. It was the kind of place people forgot once they buried someone and moved on. The sign at the front gate was rotted and leaning. Ivy choked the fences. The headstones were sinking or broken. There were beer cans in the grass, animal droppings, and broken glass where kids must have hung out at night. When the local historical society asked for help to clean it up, I signed up. I didn't have much going on. I figured a bit of yard work, some peace and quiet, maybe even something good to put on a resume. Most of the volunteers came once or twice and then stopped showing up. The place was out of the way and depressing, but I kept going. I like being alone with my thoughts. There was something honest about pulling weeds around someone's grave or lifting fallen branches and hauling them to the edge of the woods. The work was slow and quiet. Sometimes I'd listen to music or podcasts, but often I left my phone in the car. It was better that way. On the third week, I noticed the drain. It was down at the far edge of the cemetery, near a row of collapsed stones. You wouldn't see it unless you went looking. It was maybe 2 feet wide, made of rusted metal bars welded into a circular frame and set into the earth at an angle. A little channel had been dug out to direct rainwater from the slope above into it. The ground there was soft and mossy. When it rained, the whole section got boggy, and I could see where the runoff trickled down toward the pipe. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cemeteries need drainage like any place else. I figured it was part of an old stormwater system, maybe connected to the street drains half a mile away. But then, one evening, something strange happened. I'd stayed late to finish clearing a big pile of dead branches. The sun was going down, but I wanted to make one more trip before I left. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Then I heard something. It was faint at first. A sound carried on the wind. I thought it might be kids again, maybe back near the trees, but when I paused and turned my head, I realized it was coming from the ground. I stepped closer. The sound was coming from the drain. I walked down toward it, my boots sinking slightly in the damp ground. As I stood over the grate, I heard it again, thin and broken like someone crying. A kind of whimper, then something like a word. I crouched down, put my ear closer. It sounded like a person, not shouting, just soft, almost like pleading. It made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I looked around, expecting to see someone playing a prank. But there was nobody, just the trees, the old stones, the slow wind. I looked into the drain. Nothing, just blackness, water trickling somewhere far below. I stood up and backed away. I told myself it had to be wind or maybe water echoing through the pipes. But it stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that soft voice in my head. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe I just heard a dog or a bird, and my brain twisted it into something human. I went back and did my work like usual. But as the sun dipped again, I felt the tension come back. I didn't want to go near the drain, but I did. I needed to know. I walked down slowly. The breeze was colder that evening. When I reached the pipe, I crouched again and listened. Nothing. I waited a full minute. Then, faint and distant, I heard it again. It was clearer this time. Not words exactly, but the pattern of speech rises and falls like someone trying to talk but too far away to hear clearly. It had a rhythm to it. Not angry, not urgent. Just lost, like someone stuck. I leaned closer and stared into the black circle of the pipe. My heart was beating faster now. The sound came and went. I couldn't make out what it said, if it was saying anything at all, but it was human. I was sure of that. That night, I looked up old maps of the area. I found some records online that showed the cemetery had once drained into an old city storm system that ran beneath the neighborhood to the west. A series of pipes built in the 1960s, long before proper zoning. Most of them have been covered or rerouted since then, but the blueprints showed a connection between the graveyard's drain and the city storm lines. One long pipe, almost 100 yards, linked it to a main storm sewer that passed beneath a residential area near 12th Street. That made a kind of sense. Maybe the sounds I heard weren't voices at all, just street noise echoing through the pipes. Maybe if the wind was right, it funneled sound through the metal and stone and twisted it into something that sounded human. It made sense, but the way it sounded didn't. It wasn't random. It had a feeling. Something about it wasn't right. I started coming by later and later. I said I was behind on my cleanup work, but the truth was I wanted to hear it again. And I did. Every night. Sometimes it sounded like a single person. Other times, more than one. Whispers, fragments, soft sighs, and muttering. It never got loud. It never became clear. But it kept happening. One night, I brought a flashlight and pointed it into the drain. The beam lit only a short distance before vanishing into wet black. I tossed a stone in and listened. It rattled once, then silence. No es plus, no hecho. Like it was just absorbed. I got braver. I came with a small voice recorder and left it running at the mouth of the drain for an hour. When I played it back at home, the sound was faint, but it was there. Not words, but something almost like sobbing. I replayed it 10 times, trying to be sure. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That the drain was haunted? I didn't believe that. I still don't, but I knew what I was hearing. The breakthrough came by accident. It had rained hard for 2 days straight. When I came to the cemetery that Thursday, the ground was soaked and the drain was gurgling with water. I went down to check it, and for once, the sound was clear. Not human voices, actual city noise. I heard a siren, then a honk, then something that might have been a TV playing behind a closed window. It wasn't ghostly at all. It was just noise. The storm had filled the system and opened up the sound paths. The same way a trumpet amplifies air, the long metal pipe was catching sound from the storm sewer below the city and pushing it upward into the cemetery. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The drain at the cemetery was like an accidental speaker. When the wind was right and when the pressure in the pipes was just so, it funneled sound from the city and distorted it. Turned everyday life, arguments, TVs, laughter, street traffic into something muffled and lost, something that felt like a voice pleading for help. I tested it. I came by during busy hours, and I could hear buses and construction. I came late at night, and sometimes heard a baby crying, probably from an apartment on 12th Street. The storm sewer ran past hundreds of people living their lives above it, and the drain in the cemetery turned that life into something hollow and eerie. It was never haunted, just a freak of acoustics. A drain pipe angled just right to catch the breath of the city and twisted into something that felt human, but wasn't. Still, I stopped going after that. Not because I was scared anymore, but because the mystery was gone. I thought maybe someone needed help, that maybe there was something trapped down there. But it was just sound, wind and concrete, metal and water. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I think about those first few evenings. The way the sound rose and fell. The way it felt like someone was waiting. Not every mystery is meant to be solved, but I'm glad this one was. And I never went back to the drain again. I started my thesis with the idea that cemeteries told stories, not just in their headstones or their layouts, but in their silence. I was in my final year of architecture school, specializing in environmental spatial planning, and I thought it'd be smart to mix urban design with anthropology. Cemeteries were perfect for that. They held history, symmetry, intention. I pitched the idea to my advisor, something about the spatial psychology of burial grounds, and he signed off with barely a glance. That's how I ended up spending weeks walking through graveyards, sketching site plans, and jotting down notes about angles, trees, pathways, and stonework. I chose a mix of urban and rural sites to compare layout trends over time. Most of them were uneventful. Peaceful, really. I'd sit with my back to an old oak tree and just watch how people move through the space, or I'd pace the rows, try to figure out why some sections felt heavier than others. Nothing strange, nothing worth remembering, really, except for the one on the hill, Grinstead Cemetery. It was technically just outside of town, on a long slope with high-tension power lines cutting across the ridge above it. I found it through an old planning record. It hadn't been used much in recent years, but the city still mowed it, and it had clear survey maps. I drove out there on a cold Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee and a stack of printouts. Grinstead was quiet, more than quiet, still. There were no houses around, just an access road that led past a locked maintenance gate and a small gravel lot. The first thing I noticed was the wind. It was constant up there. Not gusts, just a steady, light push of air that never stopped. I don't know why that unsettled me. Maybe because the trees barely moved with it. It didn't feel like normal wind. It didn't feel like anything was being stirred up or moved around. Just constant pressure. I walked the site like I always did, sketchpad under one arm, doing a basic grid walk. The cemetery was split into 6 rough rows, some headstones upright, others sunken or tilted. A few of the plots had old iron markers, rusted into strange reddish shapes. That was the first thing I made a note of. Iron wasn't used much anymore. Most of the new places used stone or concrete. But here, they tried ornate Victorian ironwork. It had weathered badly, like burnt bones scattered through the grass. About an hour in, I heard it. A low hum. I couldn't place it at first. I thought it was the wind shifting direction, or maybe a truck engine somewhere beyond the hill. But when I stopped moving, it was still there. Low. Even almost like the sound you hear when you press your ear to the floor. except it wasn't in my ears. It felt like it was coming from the air. I looked up. The power lines were overhead, thick cables stretching from one concrete tower to the next, humming faintly. That had to be it. I'd read about electromagnetic vibrations from high-tension lines. They could buzz at certain frequencies, sometimes even affecting how you feel. I moved on, but as the week went on, the sound didn't go away. In fact, it started feeling stronger. Each day I returned, usually in the early morning. The hum would greet me like it had been waiting. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even really sound, not in the normal sense. It was more like pressure, like when you walk into a room with an industrial freezer and there's this soft, constant tone in the background that you can't unhear once you notice it. At first, I thought I was just tired. I wasn't sleeping well at that point. Too much caffeine, too many deadlines, stress about graduation. But something about that cemetery made the tiredness worse. I'd go there for an hour, maybe two, and come home feeling like I'd been awake for days. My eyes would twitch. My thoughts would blur. By the end of the second week, I started getting headaches. Deep ones right behind the eyes. I told myself it was dehydration. I drank more water. It didn't help. I started recording the sessions, thinking maybe I could catch the sound and analyze it. I borrowed a field mic and a digital recorder from the media lab on campus. The first few days, I got nothing. Just wind and footsteps. But one afternoon, as I sat on the stone lip of an old family plot, I heard something on playback that made me sit up straight. It wasn't the hum. It was something that sounded like a whisper. I listened to it 5 or 6 times. The first few seconds were just static and wind, but then, right around the 22-minute mark, there was a dip in the noise floor, followed by what I can only describe as a breath. Not words, not clearly, but something like air being moved near the mic, soft and very, very close. It was probably nothing. I told myself it was my own breath, even though I'd kept the mic on a tripod several feet away. I dismissed it and kept going. But from that day on, I couldn't stop listening for it. I'd set up the mic, leave it running, then walk around with my notebook. Every evening, I'd go home and comb through the audio. Most of the time, it was just hum and wind. But every now and then, faint little shifts, breathy textures, like the sound of someone about to speak. It messed with my head. I started staying up late, watching the waveform on my laptop, looking for anomalies. I'd go back into the recordings and crank the gain, isolating slices of background noise that maybe had meaning. My ears started ringing at night. I thought I was getting an ear infection. The student clinic said it was probably stress. One morning, I got a Grinstead just after sunrise. I hadn't slept at all. I felt lightheaded, like my body wasn't quite inside itself. I stood near the northwest fence and just stared out over the hill. The cemetery sloped downward in soft ridges. The rows of headstones looked like teeth half buried in sand. That's when I noticed something new. The hum was stronger near the old maintenance shed. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. It was just a weathered structure near the edge of the property, locked and boarded shut. Probably where they kept tools back when the place had staff. But standing near it that morning, the low vibration became more noticeable. Not just in my ears, but in my chest, like a subwoofer in the ground, pulsing slowly. I leaned against the wall of the shed, and the wood itself felt warm. Not sun warm, current warm. I made a mental note to come back with the recorder. That afternoon, I brought the mic close to the shed and left it running for almost an hour. When I reviewed the footage later, I found something that made my stomach turn. Right around the 40-minute mark, the hum cut out for just a few seconds. In that pause, I heard a new noise, clearer than before. A low, rhythmic syllable pattern. Not music, not speech, but something close to both. Almost like a word being repeated too faintly to understand. I couldn't stop listening. That night, I dreamed I was lying in the cemetery flat on the grass, unable to move. The hum was so loud in the dream that it rattled my bones. I could feel it shaking through my ribs. When I woke up, my jaw was clenched so hard it hurt to open it. The next day, I skipped class and went back to the cemetery. I needed answers. I walked along the fence line, behind the shed, looking for something, anything that would explain it. And that's when I found the cables. Thin, rusted wires, half buried in the soil. They snaked from the back of the shed out toward the woods, where the power lines ran. Some of the wires were cut. Others disappeared under dead leaves. I followed them as far as I could until I hit a locked metal hatch, half sunken into the ground. It looked old, unmarked. My first thought was drainage access, but the wires told a different story. That evening, I called an old professor who had worked with environmental acoustics. I didn't mention the cemetery, just asked him hypothetically about sound illusions from EM interference. He talked for 20 minutes about how electromagnetic fields can interfere with brain activity, especially under sleep deprivation or stress. In rare cases, he said, people exposed to overlapping EM sources had reported auditory hallucinations, especially near certain types of metal. My whole body went cold. I started connecting the dots. The power lines, the old metal markers, the strange vibration in the shed wall, the whisper-like recordings, my lack of sleep, the migraines, the pressure in my head. It all fit. That night, I wrote down everything I'd experienced, every date, every sound, every location, and started mapping it against the topography. I realized that the cemetery's highest point, the ridge near the shed, was directly beneath a junction in the power lines, a crisscross of major tension cables. And below that, probably forgotten by now, some sort of wiring or hardware left from when the site had real staff. Maybe for lighting, maybe irrigation. Whatever it was, it had been left to rot and interact with a massive EM field. And my body had become the antenna. The whispers, the breathy sounds, the vibrating pressure, they weren't ghosts. They were sensory distortions. My nervous system picking up interference. My sleep-deprived brain misfiring, trying to decode noise as meaning. I went back. I was moving south, following a narrow back road that snaked through hills and farmland. I had a rough plan: stick to the old routes, walk till sundown, camp wherever I could. It was quiet country. Sometimes I'd go hours without seeing a car. The fields were dotted with rusted-out tractors and barns that sagged like tired animals. There wasn't much reason for anyone to be out here, except maybe people like me, drifting through, trying to stay off the main highways, away from the noise. It was late afternoon when I reached the hill with the cemetery. It wasn't marked on any of my maps, just a small plot on a knoll, maybe 20 or 30 graves, surrounded by a rusted iron fence. The gate was broken, hanging on one hinge. The gravel road cut close to it, then curled back into the woods. The grass was overgrown, the stones cracked and faded. Most of the names were too worn to read. As I walked past, I slowed down. I wasn't sure why. I hadn't seen anything move, but something pulled at me. Maybe it was the strange quiet, the kind that's not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, like static behind silence. I paused and looked up the hill. There were voices. At first I thought it was wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was layered. Low and garbled, but definitely human voices. More than one, like several people speaking at once, but not saying anything clear. Just a jumble of syllables and occasional sharp bursts, like a word trying to form, but getting tangled up. I stood still for a long time. It was one of those moments where logic tries to step in. Maybe it's a radio from a farmhouse, or something blowing through a drain pipe. But I couldn't convince myself. The sound was coming from the cemetery, low and pulsing like it was beneath the ground. I told myself to move on, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped through the broken gate. The air felt dry and weirdly warm. The sun was already getting low, brushing the tops of the trees in orange. I walked slowly between the graves. The voices were louder now, but still tangled. One would rise up, almost separate from the others, then vanish again into the mix. There was no rhythm, no song, just broken noise, buried under gravel and breath. The grave that caught my attention was on the far end of the plot. It had a military-style marker, flat, rectangular, sunk into the dirt. The name was barely visible, but I could make out the rank. Staff Sergeant. No birth or death date. Just the name, the rank, and a symbol in the corner. It looked like the emblem of a communications unit. A signal corps. The sound was strongest here. I crouched, pressed my ear to the soil. I didn't want to, but I did. The static hummed up through the dirt. I could hear words trying to shape themselves, numbers maybe, or names, but nothing stuck. I felt like I was picking up someone's thoughts on a frayed wire. I stayed there for maybe an hour, just crouched near that grave. The sun dipped behind the trees. The air turned cold, fast, and still I didn't move. I hadn't planned to sleep out in the open, especially not near a graveyard, but I couldn't leave. Not without figuring it out. That's what it became, a puzzle I had to solve. I pitched my tent just off the path, maybe 30 yards from the cemetery fence. I boiled water, ate from a packet. All the while, the noise continued. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake with a sharp burst of static in my ears, like someone had flipped on an old radio just beside my head. I finally gave up around 3 a.m. and sat outside, wrapped in my coat, watching the cemetery in the dark. It looked like any other plot of land. Nothing moved. No lights. Just that soft, broken whisper that never stopped. When the sun came up, I went back in with a small trowel for my pack. I didn't have a plan, but I kept thinking about that grave. I told myself I'd just check the surface, see if there was something odd. A speaker, a wire, something left over from a prank or an art installation. But the deeper I went, the more wrong it felt. Maybe 2 feet down, my trowel hit metal. I cleared the dirt with my hands, fast, heart pounding. It was a box, a dented, weather-worn metal case, like something from a military surplus store. I pried it out. It was heavy, and it buzzed faintly in my hands. Not from power, but from the sound. The static was coming from inside it. I carried it back to my tent. It took a while to open. There were bolts on the side, half rusted shut. When I got it open, I just stared. It was a ham radio unit. Old, probably from the 60s or 70s. The kind of gear a field operator might use during wartime. It was wired to a battery pack that had clearly leaked and corroded everything around it. But somehow it was still running. The wires had been jury-rigged, with a mess of copper threading into what looked like a half-melted capacitor. I don't know enough about electronics to explain it, but it shouldn't have been working. Not like this. Not buried. The signal was looping. I found the output jack and attached it to my small field speaker. The sound sharpened, not clearer but louder. The voices overlapped like layers of broken tape. Then, after maybe 3 minutes, the loop restarted. Same sounds, same pattern. A burst of static, then words or almost words, then a sharp blip, then silence, then repeat. I recorded the whole thing. I spent the next few hours cleaning it up. I had some tools, a basic signal scanner. I even used an old frequency app on my phone. What I found made my stomach turn. The signal wasn't just random noise. It was a message. A broken one? Sure, but it had structure. There were fragments of military call signs, location codes, and what sounded like parts of a distress report. I caught bits of phrases: outpost breached, signal compromised, hold position. None of it was complete. Like someone had tried to splice together a transmission from a dozen broken reels. There were names, too. Only partials. Johnson, maybe Alvarez, a few others. The same ones, repeating in different places in the loop. What really got me was the gravel. I know that sounds strange, but every so often, beneath the voices, there was the sound of footsteps on gravel. I recognized it because it matched the sound I'd heard on the road the day before. Dry crunching, steady, slow, like someone walking in circles. That detail made it feel real. Too real. Someone had recorded this out there, near that grave, maybe decades ago. I tried researching the name on the grave using my phone's data, but it wasn't listed in any of the veterans databases I could access. Not with the rank and unit. It was like he'd been wiped. That night, I didn't sleep again. The box kept playing. I left it open in the tent, sitting in the corner like a mouth, trying to speak, but only coughing up broken sound. Around midnight, I started walking the cemetery again, flashlight in hand. That's when I found the second wire. It was barely visible, buried under a line of moss near the base of another grave. I followed it, carefully pulling it free as I walked. It ran behind the plot, through the trees, down a slope, and into a ditch near the road. There, buried under leaves and rocks, was another box, smaller and almost completely corroded through. I pulled it up, opened it, and found more wiring. Not connected to a battery this time, just twisted copper and an old grounding rod jammed into the earth. This one wasn't transmitting, but it had been once. It was part of the same system. That's when it hit me. Someone had built a field communications network in that cemetery. Not recently, years ago, maybe even during a training op or field exercise. But it had been left behind, buried and forgotten. And somehow, parts of it still worked. Maybe from battery runoff or groundwater reactivating the circuits. I don't know, but the noise was real and the signal had survived. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just a system nobody shut down properly. It kept talking long after the war or the drill or the assignment had ended, repeating the same broken report over and over like someone trapped in a loop. I packed it all up in the morning. The bigger box, the speaker, the wiring. I logged the coordinates and later reported it to a regional veterans group when I got to the next town with reception. They didn't say much, just thanked me and said they'd investigate. I don't know if they ever did. What stayed with me, though, wasn't the sound or the equipment. It was the fact that someone had built it. Someone had stood in that cemetery, wiring those boxes together, maybe late at night, maybe under orders. They buried the gear, marked the grave, and left it to run. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they forgot. But the earth remembered. The static remembered. It kept trying to talk. And for a while, I listened. I took the job at the graveyard because it was seasonal, quiet, and paid just enough to cover rent and a few groceries. That's all I really needed. I wasn't looking for something permanent, and I liked keeping to myself. They gave me a little trailer to stay in on the far edge of the cemetery, just past the main drive that looped through the graves. The land spread for a few acres, with old trees lining the perimeter and a patch of woods creeping up the northern edge. I didn't mind the stillness. In fact, I preferred it. The graveyard itself was old. Most of the stones were chipped or sun-bleached, names and dates worn away by decades of wind and rain. The newest section had more recent headstones, smooth, polished granite, usually with flower holders and family plots. My job was basic. Mow the grass, trim around the stones, pull up weeds, pick up trash, clean the shed, check for damage after storms. The kind of work that doesn't require talking or thinking much. The maintenance shed was a squat, metal roof structure with 2 padlock doors and a small ventilation window near the top. Inside, there were rows of rusted tools, old gas cans, a riding mower that barely started, and a workbench covered in bolts, rags, and half-empty oil bottles. It smelled like gasoline and mildew. I started noticing the whispering sounds about a week into the job. It was always in the early morning when the sky was just starting to turn pale and the fog clung low to the ground. I'd walk from the trailer to the shed with my coffee thermos, unlock the doors, and hear it, faint, low, but definitely there. Just a few syllables broken up by silence. At first, I thought it was wind pulling through the shed vents, or maybe some insects buzzing in the walls. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like voices, and not just random mumbling. They were names. At first, I doubted it. You always think your mind is playing tricks when you're alone like that. I told myself I was half asleep, that maybe I was remembering names I'd read off the stones. But it kept happening. Every morning, just as I opened the shed, I'd hear it. Sometimes it would say one name. Other times, 2 or 3 in a row. Always quiet, like someone whispering through glass. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female, but it was flat, slow, and emotionless. I didn't tell anyone. There wasn't anyone to tell. Really. The groundskeeper who hired me only showed up once a week, and even then he didn't stick around long. The place was so isolated that you could scream and no one would hear it. I thought about recording the sound on my phone, but every time I opened the voice recorder, the whispering stopped. It only happened when I wasn't trying to catch it. I started writing down the names. I'd go back to the trailer, sit down at the tiny kitchen table, and scribble them out on a legal pad. I recognized some from the cemetery, older names, most of them. No one I knew personally, but a few were from newer stones I'd passed by that week. At one point, I even walked the whole place to double check. Every name I heard belonged to someone buried there. The thing that got to me was how accurate the timing was. One morning, I heard the name Darla Hennings. That afternoon, I mowed the far north row and saw her name etched into a stone that still had fresh flowers next to it. Or 1954. Died 2 weeks ago. That detail made it feel less like a hallucination and more like something I wasn't supposed to hear. I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie awake in the trailer, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. The whispering started to bleed into my dreams. I kept imagining someone standing in the shed, just behind the door, waiting for me to arrive. I'd open it and hear them just as they slipped away. I started unlocking the door slower each day, bracing myself. But the sound never changed. Always a whisper, always faint, always a name. Eventually, I decided to search the shed from top to bottom. Maybe some kind of speaker or wiring had been left behind. Maybe a prank. It made no sense for anyone to go through that kind of trouble, but I had no better explanation. I started with the obvious places, under the workbench, behind the shelves, inside the rusted lockers. Nothing. I unscrewed the ventilation cover and shined a flashlight in. Just cobwebs and dust. Then I noticed the back corner of the shed had a wooden crate pushed up against the wall. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The floor beneath it was scuffed, as if it had been dragged from place to place. I pried it open. Inside were tangled wires, an old headset, and a dust-covered audio console I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was broken radio equipment, but then I saw a strip of tape across the console labeled, UMass Project Audio, 2014. I pulled everything out and set on the bench. There were 3 long-range parabolic microphones, the kind shaped like clear satellite dishes. Each had its own cord and battery pack. The wires ran to a central recorder with a date stamp screen and a volume knob. One of the battery packs still had enough juice to turn on the console when I flipped the switch. The screen blinked to life, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when the headphones hissed and then went quiet. I put them on. Static at first, then faint voices, just like I'd heard in the mornings. But this time they were clearer. Still soft, still distant, but definitely words. Names, sometimes repeated, sometimes broken up by wind or leaves or other background noise. I found a stack of notebooks buried under the console. Each one was filled with time logs, coordinates, and field notes. From what I could tell, a group of university students had been using the shed as a test location for a project on natural sound archiving. They'd set up the mics to point at different parts of the woods, logging which areas produced the clearest long-distance echoes. The idea was to record ambient sounds and catalog how they bounced through open terrain and wooded space. But somewhere along the line, they'd started picking up conversations, voices from farther away than expected, echoes that didn't match any of the nearby graveside visits or known activities. The last few entries got messy. Scribbled notes like voices repeating every morning and no movement in the woods, but sound persists, and Darla, same voice, 3 mornings in a row. Then the logs just stopped. No mention of shutting it down. No record of removing the equipment. It was like they packed it into the crate and left. I started thinking about the setup. The microphones weren't aimed at the graveyard. They were pointed outward toward the woods, which meant the voices weren't coming from the graves, but from somewhere beyond them. Possibly from people walking through the trees. Possibly from houses in the distance. Maybe even hunters, campers, anyone passing by. Long-range mics can carry surprising distances under the right conditions. But what didn't sit right with me was the timing. Why were the names only spoken at dawn? Why only once per day? And why did they always match people recently buried in the cemetery? I tested one of the microphones myself. I set it up on a tripod just outside the shed, aimed it toward the woods, and left it running with the headphones on the bench. At dawn, I sat there in the trailer, waiting. Sure enough, just after 5:30 a.m., the voices came through. One name, then another, then silence. I got up, walked the cemetery, and matched both names to stones less than a month old. I checked the woods for anyone. Nothing. No campers. No hikers. No kids pulling a prank. Just trees and mist and silence. My only theory was that someone had used this setup deliberately. Maybe during burial services, they turned on the recorder. Maybe the mics picked up the names being said by family, friends, ministers, and stored the echoes. The kind of long-range capture could preserve sound for days, maybe even weeks if conditions were right. Fog, open terrain, low wind. All of it could create acoustic reflections. Maybe what I heard each morning was just a playback of what had already been said. Echoes cycling back under the right humidity, the right temperature. But even that felt thin. I called the university, told them I was a seasonal worker at a cemetery and had found some old equipment marked UMass Project Audio. The receptionist transferred me to someone in the media department, then to someone else. Eventually, I got a grad student who admitted there had been a project years ago that did sound testing in rural locations, but he said most of the data had been lost and no one followed up because of weird anomalies. He didn't explain what that meant. I asked what happened to the recordings. He said they were on portable drives, maybe still stored in the university archives, but probably wiped. The project never got published. It was written off as inconclusive. I kept the equipment for a while. I moved it into the trailer and cleaned it off. Part of me wanted to keep testing it to see how far the voices traveled to map where they were coming from. But part of me didn't want to know. Eventually, the whispering stopped. It was sudden. One morning, I opened the shed and there was nothing. Just the creak of the hinges, the scrape of gravel underfoot. I waited, sat with the headphones, turned the console on and off. Silence. I don't know if the weather changed. I don't know if the echo cycle had run its course. Maybe the battery on the equipment finally died. Or maybe whatever voices were being picked up, it started with silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring after a while. That weird background your brain invents to fill the empty space. I had been staying in that chapel for 3 days before I noticed it. And I think it was the stillness that first started messing with me. I've been looking for a place to lay low for a bit. Nothing dramatic, just needed time away from people, from noise, from all the usual stuff. My work had dried up. I didn't have anywhere else to go. And the idea of being left alone in a crumbling cemetery chapel didn't sound so bad at the time. The chapel sat on the far edge of a small countryside cemetery that wasn't even in use anymore. I had found it after a long walk, following a winding dirt road that led out of town nobody even stopped in unless their car broke down. The building looked like it had been built 100 years ago. Old stone walls, wooden doors that sagged on their hinges, and stained glass windows with big cracks running through the colored panels. The floor was wooden, covered in dry leaves that blew in through the gaps near the doors. The roof had a few holes, but most of it was still intact. It smelled of old rot, dust, and the dry tang of dead flowers. I had a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a small bag of food. I'd been living out of my pack for a while by then. I found a clear space near the altar, far enough from the broken windows that wind didn't hit me directly. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the wooden boards, shook out the dust, and tried to make it home for the time being. The first night was quiet. I remember the wind, the creaking of the wood, and the occasional sound of leaves dragging across the floor. I didn't sleep well. It was cold. I kept waking up thinking I heard something, a faint thud, a soft knock, but when I sat up and listened, it was just nothing. The second night, same thing. And then, the third night, I started hearing voices. Not talking, not clearly. More like murmurs. Like someone mumbling 2 rooms away, behind a thick wall. I lay in my sleeping bag and listen hard, try to figure out where it was coming from. I thought it might be the wind at first, but it wasn't the wind. It came from underneath me. At first I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. When you stay alone in a dead silent place for long enough, your brain starts filling in the blanks. I'd read that somewhere, but the fourth night, the murmurs were louder. Not clearer, but louder. Definitely voices and definitely coming from under the floorboards. I got up and walked around the chapel barefoot, stepping slowly and quietly so I could hear better. I crouched near the back corner where the boards felt slightly different, less solid. I pressed my ear to the ground. For a while, there was nothing. Then a low thump, like something shifting deep under the floor, followed by another round of muffled voices. I stayed like that for almost an hour. Still couldn't make out what they were saying. The next day, I started looking more closely at the floor. Some of the planks near the rear wall were warped and splintered. A couple were loose. I pried one up using a rock I found outside. Underneath was dry dirt. Just dirt. But the sound had definitely come from deeper than that. I pulled up more boards. A small space opened up, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. I cleared away more dirt and discovered a patch of brick. I tapped on it with a rock. Hollow. It took me most of the day, but I cleared enough dirt and pried away enough bricks to reveal an opening. A square of darkness, about 2 feet across, led down into the ground. It looked like a vertical shaft lined with bricks. I leaned in with my flashlight and pointed it down. The light disappeared into black. I couldn't see the bottom. I didn't go down that night. I put the boards back as best I could, moved my sleeping bag away from that area, and stayed up most of the night just listening. The murmurs came again, and something else too. A faint metallic tapping, like someone clinking a coin against a pipe, slowly and deliberately. By the 5th day, I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I needed to know. I packed up my things and lowered them into the hole using my sleeping bag cords. Then I started climbing down. The shaft was narrow and awkward. The bricks were uneven and crumbling. I used them as makeshift steps, holding the flashlight in my mouth, carefully testing each foothold before shifting my weight. The descent took maybe 20 feet before the shaft opened into a tunnel. It was dark, cold, and smelled like wet stone. The walls were made of the same old bricks, and the floor was dirt. The ceiling was low. I had to crouch. I followed the tunnel, moving slowly, trying not to make noise. After 20 or 30 feet, I found the first side passage. It was barely wide enough for a person. I kept walking straight. The air was stale and damp. I passed an old pipe running along the ceiling, then another. I realized there was a whole network of these tunnels crisscrossing beneath the chapel and probably beyond the cemetery. I stopped when I saw a light up ahead, just a faint glow. I turned off my flashlight and stood still. The glow flickered slightly, like it was coming from a candle or small fire. I crept forward one slow step at a time until I could see around the bend. There was a small chamber. 2 people sat inside. They were hunched over, wrapped in filthy blankets and surrounded by bags and cans. One held a lighter. The other held something metal. They were heating up food on a piece of scrap, metal balanced over a small flame. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. That night, I didn't go back to the chapel. I slept behind the cemetery wall, hidden in the grass, and waited. In the morning, I saw no one coming out. No sign of movement, but that didn't make it better. I couldn't stop thinking about how long they'd been down there, how many of them there were. I spent the next few days exploring more of the tunnels. I went further each time, marking my path with chalk and broken sticks so I wouldn't get lost. I found more chambers, more signs of life. Empty cans, torn clothes, old plastic tarps pinned to the walls. Sometimes I saw movement at the end of a tunnel and turned back. Sometimes I just listened. One afternoon, deep underground, I found a pipe sticking out of the wall. It had small holes drilled in the side. I leaned in and heard the voices again. Clearer this time. Multiple people talking all at once, their words tumbling over each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was definitely coming from inside the pipe. That's when I figured it out. They were using the old ventilation shafts to communicate. The pipes must have been part of some ancient heating or air system from when the chapel had a basement or when the cemetery had caretakers. Some of them still worked. You could hear from one chamber to another if you knew where to listen. It became clear over time. This wasn't just a couple of homeless people hiding in a tunnel. This was a full system, a hidden camp, people living underground, surviving in complete silence, hidden under a forgotten chapel in a cemetery no one visited. I started finding signs of organization. Ropes strung across beams to hang clothes, old pallets laid flat for sleeping platforms, even shelves built into the walls made from old crates and bricks. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have anyone to tell anyway. And honestly, I didn't want to. These people weren't hurting anyone. They were surviving, hiding from something, probably the world above. I started leaving food near the shaft entrance. Cans of beans, crackers, bottles of water. I never saw who took them, but they disappeared by morning. Once they left something behind, a small piece of folded cloth with a single coin wrapped inside. I didn't take it. The last night I stayed in the chapel, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened again to the floor. The murmurs came again, and the soft tap-tap of metal on metal. But this time, it didn't feel eerie. It felt like life. Hidden, desperate life, but life all the same. In the morning, I replaced the boards, packed up my things, and left. I never went back, but I think about a lot. About the people living under that chapel floor. People no one knows are there. People who talk through pipes and share candlelight in the dark. They're the whole world down there, quiet and careful and hidden from everyone. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people like anyone else, trying to stay alive in the only place left to them. Sometimes I hear things in the silence now, even when I know I'm alone. The ringing in my ears starts again, and I remember the chapel, the floorboards, the hole in the dirt, and I wonder if they're still down there, still talking through the pipes, still tapping messages into the dark. I took the job as caretaker of the Harrow's End Cemetery mainly because I needed the money. I just left the city after things went bad with a contracting job, and this was the only offer that came through fast. The cemetery was about 40 miles outside the nearest town, tucked behind a long gravel road that most GPS systems couldn't even track correctly. There was nothing modern around, just pine trees, thickets, and wind. It was the kind of place you wouldn't think anyone would visit unless they had someone buried there. The cemetery was spread across maybe 4 or 5 acres, with old, leaning headstones on one side and newer marble graves on the other. There were dirt paths crisscrossing through it, and everything was surrounded by a rusting iron fence that had clearly been there a long time. Some parts were in decent shape. Others had completely caved in from rust and neglect. My job was simple: keep the grass trimmed, pick up trash, make sure nothing looked abandoned or forgotten. I stayed in a small caretaker's house at the edge of the cemetery, maybe 40 yards from the fence. The house had 2 rooms, electricity from a line that cut through the trees, and no internet. That first week it felt peaceful. I cleaned the tool shed, mowed the grass, realigned a few of the crooked stones, and even patched up a few signs along the path. The nights were quiet, eerily so. No cars, no distant traffic, just frogs and crickets. But toward the end of the second week, something strange started happening. It was a Thursday evening, just as the sky was getting darker. I'd gone out to finish trimming weeds near the back corner of the cemetery, near the part of the fence that was badly rusted. That section always made me uneasy. The iron bars were warped and bent, and some had even fallen out of the ground completely. Trees leaned heavy over it, and something about that stretch always felt colder than the rest. I was putting the trimmer away when I thought I heard someone talking. Not loud, not yelling, just a voice, speaking slowly and steadily from the direction of the broken fence row. I turned off the trimmer and stood still. At first, I figured it was wind. The trees in that area were thick, and sometimes the wind would rush through in a way that sounded almost human. But this time it was clearer, like someone murmuring from the trees just outside the fence. I moved closer, squinting toward the woods. There was nothing there. I waited for a minute, but the sound had stopped. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been a bird, or some noise carried from farther away. That area always gave off a weird feeling, so maybe my head was just playing tricks on me. But the next night, it happened again. Around the same time, just before full dark, I was finishing up a sweep near the graves when I heard it again. This time, it was louder. A man's voice. And this time, I could make out a few words. It was something about "don't leave me here" and "can't feel my hands." It was slow, drawn out, like someone struggling to speak. I stood still and listened. It was coming from the rusted fence line again. I walked toward it, heart racing. The sound stopped before I got there. I stood at the edge of the trees and scanned everything. Even called out once, but no one answered. Just wind, trees, and the last bit of dying light in the sky. By the third night, I started getting worried. Same time, same place. A voice again, and this time it sounded like a woman. She was saying something about her mother. Something about cold ground. It kept happening. Every night, I'd hear a new voice. They were never shouting. Always soft. Always coming from that same rusted row of the fence. Always vanishing the second I got close. I stopped trimming that side. I didn't even go over there during the day unless I absolutely had to. I wasn't sleeping well anymore. I kept waking up in the night, thinking I'd heard whispers just outside my window. I even put a chair against the inside of the door one night, just in case. After a week of this, I decided I had to figure it out. I wasn't about to quit a job. I just started over some weird sounds. So I came up with a plan. I set up an old wildlife camera I'd brought with me. the kind used for tracking deer. I mounted it to a tree across from the rusted fence row. It had a motion detector and would snap photos in low light. I left it out there overnight, pointed directly at the trees where the voices always seemed to come from. The next morning, I checked the card. There were dozens of images. Most were just empty shots of trees and grass. But in the middle of the night, around 2:40 a.m., a series of photos showed something strange. A faint light, barely visible in the trees just behind the fence. Not like a flashlight, more like a glow, low to the ground. It seemed to move across 3 frames, then vanished. There was no shape or figure, just that dim light. I was spooked, but I wasn't satisfied. I needed to know more. So I went out that afternoon and carefully walked the area behind the fence. It took a while, but after maybe 15 minutes of searching, I found something that didn't belong. Tucked into the base of a tree, hidden beneath some fallen branches, was a small black object. At first, I thought it was an old hunting camera, but when I brushed it off, I realized it was something else entirely. It looked like a speaker, round, black, with a mesh front and a tiny light on top. There were wires running from it into the dirt. I pulled the whole thing up and followed the wire. It led to a box, maybe the size of a shoebox, half buried in leaves. When I opened it, there was a small fan, a circuit board, and a blinking green light. I'd seen a lot of electronics during my time in construction, but this was beyond anything I recognized. It wasn't just a speaker. It was some kind of recording unit, wired up with a sensor, a solar panel, and what looked like a miniature drive. I carried the box back to the caretaker's house and started digging around online using my phone's hotspot. After a few hours, I found something disturbing. It wasn't just a speaker. It was part of a covert audio surveillance system, military-grade stuff. The kind of thing used in long-term monitoring of outdoor locations. There were articles about a government contractor running illegal tests of AI-driven audio systems. These things recorded ambient sound, analyzed it, then repeated specific voices and phrases back during low-activity periods as a way of simulating presence for deterrent testing. They were designed to make people think someone was around. They could mimic voices, real voices, and some of them have been quietly tested in remote locations, especially places with limited foot traffic like parks, nature reserves, and apparently graveyards. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went back out with a shovel and gloves. I searched that entire section of the woods behind the rusted fence. I found 2 more speaker units, both buried and camouflaged. Same kind of build, same wiring, same AI tags on the inside. I pulled all of them out and put them in a box in the shed. But I still had one more question. Where are they getting the voices? That answer came a few days later. I started comparing the voices I'd heard to recordings from burial ceremonies I'd attended while working there. Some people would play pre-recorded messages, eulogies, or songs at graveside services. I realized that many of the phrases I'd heard were taken directly from those moments. "Don't leave me here," one man had said, crying at his brother's grave. "She was always cold, even in the summer," a daughter had said beside her mother's casket. All of it matched. These surveillance units weren't just mimicking voices. They were recording real services and replaying fragments later, mixing them into low-volume speech as part of some kind of experimental presence feedback system. Someone had installed these things illegally. Someone had hidden this system in the trees, recorded grieving families, stored the voices, and then played them back to test how real they sounded. I later read that the system was being developed for psychological operations and law enforcement training. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that it wasn't supposed to be here. I took everything I'd found, the units, the wires, the data chips, and packaged them up. I sent an anonymous tip to a journalist who covered tech abuses. I never heard back, but within 2 weeks, a white van showed up near the entrance road, parked for a day, then vanished. After that, the voices stopped. I stayed on for a few more months before I finally left. I didn't tell the grounds manager or anyone else. I kept the story to myself, but I still remember the first voice I ever heard. It sounded like it came from beneath the ground, but it was really just echoing off the trees. A voice stolen, twisted, and repeated. People come to cemeteries to find peace. They speak words they never got to say, and somewhere along the way, someone decided to capture those moments not for memory, but for data. I still think about it sometimes. About how far someone is willing to go just to make a program sound real. About how the dead have no voice, but the living leave enough behind for others to use. And how silence, real silence, is something we've started to lose even out here in the dirt and stone.